Cole's knuckles were bleeding again. He didn't notice right away. He was elbow deep inside the nose gear housing of a Bombardier Global 7500, fighting a hydraulic fitting that had been weeping
What is
fluid
this?
since Tuesday.
Whoa, it's not what you
And the
think.
wrench slipped on
Not
the
what I
fourth
think.
attempt,
You're a mess.
his
I can
skin
explain.
catching the bracket edge with a sound like tearing paper. Blood smeared across the aluminum, mixing into the black grease already caked into every line of his hands. He pulled his fist out, looked at it the way a man looks at a minor inconvenience he's decided not to have, and shook it once. Then he went back in. 44 years old. 22 of those years spent around aircraft. The first 12 in a cockpit. The last 10 underneath one. That was the arrangement he'd made with himself, and he'd kept it the way he kept everything, without announcement, without explanation, and without the kind of visible suffering that invites other people's questions. The maintenance bay at Meridian Aviation Services smelled like jet fuel hydraulic fluid and the particular brand of stale coffee that only exists in places where men start work before the sun does. Nathan had arrived at 10 minutes to 5, same as every morning, and by the time the fluorescent lights buzzed to full brightness overhead, he'd already completed his first inspection log and was halfway through a repair that 3 other mechanics had deferred twice. He liked the early hours. The bay was quiet before 6. No pilots drifting through in pressed uniforms treating the maintenance staff like furniture that occasionally handed them things. No executives from the operations building cutting through on their way somewhere important, their shoes too clean for a place where real work happened. Just Nathan and the machines and the low mechanical hum of a facility slowly waking up around him. At 6:15, the school bus rolled past the main gate. Nathan had learned sometime in the second month of this job that the route timing put that bus directly in his sight line from the northeast corner of the bay if he happened to be working near the tool cabinet by the roll-up door, which he happened to be most mornings at exactly that time. The yellow flash moved through the chain-link fence in sections broken into frames. Sometimes, if Eli had gotten the window seat on the right side, a small hand appeared in one of those frames and moved back and forth, slow enough to be deliberate, fast enough to say something. Nathan would lift his chin. Not a wave exactly, an acknowledgement. The kind of thing that passes between two people who've developed a private language made entirely of small gestures. The bus disappeared around the curve toward Courthouse Road, and Nathan went back to the hydraulic fitting. Frank Decker's voice carried from across the bay before the man himself appeared. Frank was built for volume, a compact red-faced supervisor who communicated at a consistent level, slightly above what any situation actually required. He'd been running the morning shift at Meridian for 11 years, and he'd developed over that time the useful habit of never asking people about their lives before they'd been hired. Nathan respected that more than he'd ever said. "Read." Frank came around the tail of a Cessna Citation that was in for a brake overhaul. "How's the Global coming?" 15 minutes. "Make it 10. Hale's got a government run to Dulles this morning and she's already breathing fire downstairs. Briggs is doing the pre-flight walk-around." Nathan didn't respond to the name immediately. He knew who Victoria Hale was in the way that everyone at Meridian knew the way, the weather pattern that defines your region without needing to think about it. Diana Marsh had built Marsh Aviation Group from a single leased hangar into a 12-aircraft operation with a federal contract worth north of $400 million. She moved through this facility maybe twice a week, always with somewhere more important to be, always with the particular forward momentum of someone who had long since decided that hesitation was something other people did. In 3 years, she had looked directly at Nathan Cole exactly twice, and both times it was to ask Frank something, while Nathan happened to be standing near enough to be in her peripheral vision. He was to her the same category of thing as a well-maintained floor drain, useful, invisible, not something you thought about until it stopped working. That was fine. That was the arrangement. He finished the hydraulic fitting in 9 minutes, used a rag that was dirtier than his hands to clean what the rag could clean, and walked to the break room. His thermos sat on the table where he'd left it, black coffee, no sugar filled at the gas station on Nokesville Road before the sun came up because the break room pot produced something closer to industrial solvent. He poured a cup, leaned against the wall, and let himself have 40 seconds of nothing. His phone buzzed on the table. A text from Eli sent from the bus, "One word, Dad," and then a photograph. Eli was at his desk seat holding up a paper airplane he'd made from what appeared to be a page torn from a spiral notebook, grinning with the specific abandon of a 9-year-old who has lost a bottom tooth and hasn't yet decided to be self-conscious about it. The airplane had clearly been designed with intention. The nose fold was sharp, the wing dihedral was symmetrical, and there were small upturned tabs at the wingtips that no 9-year-old arrived at by accident. Nathan looked at that photograph longer than the photograph warranted. He wasn't looking at the airplane. He was looking at the grin, which was the same grin he'd been looking at for 9 years, and which still had the capacity on ordinary Tuesday mornings in break rooms that smelled like burnt coffee to reorder his understanding of what mattered. He typed back, "Clean-billed kid. We'll test it tonight." 3 rocket emojis came back before he'd set the phone down. He finished his coffee. The day was already pressing through the corrugated metal walls, Virginia August heat arriving like something with a grievance. He rinsed his cup in the utility sink, hung it on the hook above his thermos, and was moving back toward the bay when the shouting started. It wasn't maintenance noise. Nathan had spent a decade learning the difference between the sounds a working hangar makes and the sounds a hangar makes when something has gone wrong. This was the second kind, a sharp, ragged quality to it. Voices climbing over each other. Someone on a radio, and underneath all of it, a silence where there should have been routine sound. He walked toward it without running, which was its own kind of signal about who he was. The crowd had gathered near the tail section of the Global 7500 he'd just finished. A dozen people, line mechanics, 2 ops coordinators in yellow vests, a pair of pilots still holding their flight bags, and Frank, who was pressing his radio to his ear, with the expression of a man receiving news he was going to have to pass along. On the concrete apron 20 feet from the nose gear, there was a scatter of equipment that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. A medical kit opened and partially emptied a folded jacket someone had put under a man's head, and the specific quality of empty space that appears when paramedics have recently been present and have recently left. Nathan stopped at the edge of the group. A fueler named Danny, young guy, maybe 23, still in the phase of his career where he believed diligence was eventually noticed, turned, and provided the information without being asked. Captain Briggs had gone down on the apron during the pre-flight walk-around. His left arm first, then his legs. The paramedics were already en route to Centera, Northern Virginia. Nathan felt the information settle in him the way bad news settles in someone who has processed bad news before, not shock, but wait. Not because he knew James Briggs well, though they'd shared enough early mornings over the years to constitute something. Because he knew what the absence of a qualified captain meant in the context of a 12-aircraft fleet, a federal contract, and a departure window that was now evaporating. "Who's the backup?" he asked Danny. "Solis, Ryan Solis. He's been flying the Citation series." "How long?" "I don't know. Maybe a year. Year and a half. Type rated on the Global." Danny shook his head, and that was the answer Nathan had expected. A Bombardier Global 7500 was not a machine that forgave improvisation. It was one of the longest-range business jets in production. Intercontinental range Rolls-Royce Pearl turbofans capable of moving 75,000 pounds of aircraft at speeds that made the margin between correct and almost correct very thin indeed. You flew it with ratings, with currency, with recurrent training, or you didn't fly it. The FAA regulations on this point were not ambiguous, and the consequences of ambiguity at altitude were not the kind that generated second chances. Nathan was turning back toward the bay when the black SUV arrived. It came in fast, braking hard at the hangar entrance with the kind of stop that suggests the person inside has been running through arrival logistics for the duration of the drive. The driver's door opened, and a man in a dark suit moved to the rear before the vehicle had fully settled, but Diana Marsh was already stepping out. She moved the way people move when they've stopped negotiating with time heels on concrete, like a metronome set 3 beats faster than comfortable phone pressed to her ear, voice cutting through the ambient noise of the hangar, with the precision of something specifically engineered for that purpose. "I understand what the medical team said. What I need you to understand is that I have a Pentagon meeting at 11, and I need a crew." She ended the call before whoever was on the other end could finish their sentence. She located Frank with the efficiency of someone who has long since learned to identify the nearest decision-making body in any room. Frank straightened the way a man straightens when he hasn't done anything wrong but can't shake the feeling that something is about to be his fault. "Where's my aircraft?" "Ma'am, the Global is prepped and fueled. Captain Briggs." "I know about Briggs. Where's his replacement?" "First Officer Solis is available. He's qualified on the Citation series, but his type rating doesn't cover the Global." Diana Marsh looked at Frank the way you look at a translation that has failed to produce what you asked for. Then she turned to the assembled crew and spoke to the room. "Is there anyone in this building who can fly a Global 7500? The hangar went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everyone is simultaneously relieved not to be the person being addressed and uncomfortable about not being able to help. Pilots examined their shoes. The ops coordinators exchanged a look that communicated nothing actionable. Frank looked at the middle distance. Nathan was standing at the back of the group, half visible behind a rolling tool cart, watching it unfold with his hands at his sides and his breathing even. He'd been doing this, absorbing difficult situations without visible reaction, since before most of the people in this hangar had logged their first flight hour. It wasn't composure for its own sake. It was the habit of someone who had learned at considerable cost that panic is a luxury that comes due at the worst possible time. Diana scanned the room. Her eyes moved across the crew the way she moved through a facility efficiently, without sentiment categorizing what she saw against what she needed. They passed over the mechanics, the fuelers, the admin staff hovering near the door. And then they stopped. Nathan was standing where he was standing. The battered jumpsuit, the grease-marked face, the hands that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully restore to what they'd looked like at 25. He was not dressed like a person whose opinion was solicited in professional emergencies. He was not standing in the part of the room where important people stood. He was by every visible metric exactly what he appeared to be. "You," her voice carried. "The mechanic. What are you staring at?" "Nothing, ma'am." "Then stop standing there like you have somewhere better to be unless you can actually fly this jet." She said it the way someone throws a word into a room they're already leaving, not expecting the word to catch anything, just needing to move. Brett Harlow, a captain who wore his epaulets with the particular investment of someone for whom they represent a larger victory, actually laughed. The sound had an edge to it, the kind that means something about the person doing the laughing. A few others allowed themselves the smaller luxury of a smile. Diana didn't smile. She was too focused for that. But she let it sit, the mockery, the obvious absurdity of the suggestion hanging in the air of the hangar, like the fuel smell that never entirely left. Nathan looked at her. He did not blink, did not shift his weight, did not perform any of the small physical negotiations that signal a person absorbing a blow. He just looked at her directly, and without qualification, the way you look at something you're assessing rather than something that's affecting you. Then he reached down and set the greasy rag he'd been holding onto the surface of the tool cart, slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets down something he's done with. "Okay," he said. The word landed in the room like something physical. Diana's expression shifted, not much, but enough. "Excuse me. I said okay, I'll fly it." Brett Harlow stopped laughing. Frank's mouth opened and did not immediately close. The two ops coordinators turned to look at each other with the faces of people witnessing an event they will be describing to other people for years. Diana tilted her head. "You're serious? I don't joke about aircraft. You're a mechanic." "Yes, ma'am." "And you're telling me you can fly a Bombardier Global 7500. I'm telling you I can get you to Dulles on time." She took a step toward him. Diana Marsh had built her company through a combination of financial acuity and the specific talent for making people feel the full weight of the distance between where they stood and where she stood. Board members had renegotiated contracts under that gaze. Competitors had blinked first. She applied it now with the full measure of her attention, and Nathan Cole looked back at her the way he'd looked at a great many things that were trying to determine what he was made of. "What's your name?" "Nathan Cole." "And where did you learn to fly, Mr. Cole?" He let half a beat pass. "Community college." Harlow made a sound. A few of the others recovered enough to recognize it as safe to react. Diana did not react. She was watching Nathan with something that had moved beyond irritation into the beginning of genuine assessment. "Anyone can claim a rating," she said. "The FAA registry is public. Nathan James Cole, certificate number 3847291. He said the number the way you say something you've known so long it's indistinguishable from your name. I'll wait." She held his eyes for 3 seconds. Then she turned to Frank. "Pull it up." Frank's fingers were already moving on the tablet he'd pulled from under his arm. The registry loaded. He scrolled. His face went through several phases in rapid succession, confusion, recalibration, something approaching alarm before he settled into the expression of a man who has just been handed information that restructures his understanding of the last 3 years. "Ma'am." His voice was careful the way voices get when the information they're carrying is fragile. "He's type-rated on the Global Series, the Gulfstream G700, the Falcon 900, and—" Frank paused, blinked, read the screen again. "The C-17 Globemaster." Diana turned back to Nathan. The room had gone very still. "All current?" she asked Frank without looking at him. "All current. Recurrent training completed 4 months ago. Culpeper Regional Airport." Something moved in Diana Marsh's expression, not the collapse of the wall she maintained between herself and people who worked with their hands, but the first hairline fracture in it. She studied Nathan with the focused attention of someone who has just discovered that the map they've been using is missing a significant piece of terrain. "If you damage my aircraft," she said, "I will dismantle everything you have." "Understood. You have 30 minutes. Nathan walked toward the aircraft stairs. He didn't look at Harlow. He didn't look at the ops coordinators or the fuelers or the mechanics who were watching him the way you watch something that has stopped making sense and you're waiting for the explanation. He walked the way he always walked, with the patient, unhurried gait of someone who knows exactly where he's going and has decided the distance is irrelevant. His hand found the stair railing. He stopped there for a half-second, not visibly, not in any way that anyone watching would have been able to name as hesitation. Just the body's brief conversation with itself about what came next, conducted in the private language of muscle memory and 10 years of deliberate distance. Then he climbed. Ryan Solis was already in the right seat when Nathan came through the cockpit door. 28 years old, 400 hours, the particular alertness of someone who knows they're in over their head and is trying to compensate with visible attentiveness. His checklist was open to the wrong section. His hands resting on his thighs were not entirely steady. Nathan dropped into the left seat. The leather settled under his weight with a familiarity that had no business being there after a decade. The shape of the captain's seat in a heavy jet is specific, the angle of the back, the position of the armrests relative to the throttle quadrant, the way the instrument panel arranges itself in your peripheral vision when you're properly seated. Nathan's hands found the yoke without looking, the way hands find things they've found 10,000 times before, and for a moment the 10 years between the last time and this time compressed into something almost weightless. He let the moment pass. Then he turned to Solis. "You're Solis?" "Yes, sir. First Officer Ryan Solis. I should tell you I only have around 400 total hours, and I don't need your resume. I need you to listen and do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" Solis nodded with the speed of someone grateful to be given a task. "Yes, sir." "Open your checklist to pre-flight page 1. Start reading." Solis fumbled the pages. The pre-flight checklist for the Global 7500 is methodical, comprehensive, and designed to be followed in exact sequence by 2 people who each have a defined role. Nathan's responses came without delay. Each system verified each switch, confirmed each status, acknowledged, before Solis had finished speaking the prompt. The rhythm of it was wrong in the way that only becomes apparent when you've heard the right rhythm. Nathan was too fast, too certain, responding not from effort, but from a place below conscious thought where the procedures had been stored long enough to become automatic. Solis noticed. He couldn't help noticing. He'd trained with instructors, flown with experienced captains, spent enough hours in cockpits to recognize the difference between someone working from memory and someone working from something deeper than memory. He kept reading, and he kept his observations to himself, which was the correct decision. Nathan keyed the radio. Meridian ground November 44 Kilo Delta requesting engine start and taxi clearance. Destination Dulles. 2 souls on board. The ground controller's response was routine. Cleared to start. Taxi via Alpha to runway 27, altimeter setting. Nathan read back the clearance with a precision that comes from knowing that the words of a readback are not a formality, but a contract proof that the information has been received and understood and will be acted upon correctly. Alpha to 27, he confirmed. November 44 Kilo Delta. Solis was watching Nathan's hands as they moved across the overhead panel, the throttle quadrant, the FMS keyboard. There was no excess motion. Every input was placed with the economy of someone for whom the cockpit is not a space to be navigated, but a space that has been internalized to the point where the boundary between operator and instrument becomes technical rather than practical. They were taxiing before Solis spoke again. "Sir, can I ask something?" "Make it quick." "Who are you, I mean, actually?" Nathan's jaw shifted. A muscle moved in his cheek, brief, involuntary, the kind of physical tell that surfaces when a question arrives from a direction that leads somewhere kept locked. "The guy in the left seat," he said. "That's all you need right now." They reached the runway threshold. Nathan brought the aircraft to a stop and ran the final checks with the methodical calm of someone who has performed this sequence so many times that he no longer needs to think about any individual step, only about the silence that should exist when everything is correct. Engine instruments all green. Flight controls full and free. Trim set. Flaps configured for departure. He took one breath. The last time he had done this, Drew Calloway had been on his wing. 26 years old. The most naturally gifted young aviator Nathan had encountered in 12 years of flying, a kid from El Paso who had taped photographs of the space shuttle to the inside of his helmet visor and spoke about Mars colonization the way other people spoke about their weekend plans. Calloway had a nickname before he'd earned one because he was the kind of person about whom nicknames were preemptive. Everyone around him sensed early that he was going somewhere significant and wanted to have been there from the beginning. They called him Ace, and the name fit the way good names fit, which is to say it felt less like something given and more like something recognized. Ace had been 26 years old and going to Mars, and then there had been a sound Nathan still heard in certain kinds of silence, and then there hadn't been Ace anymore. Nathan's hands tightened on the yoke. Meridian Tower, November 44, Kilo Delta, ready for departure, runway 27. November 44 Kilo Delta, winds 240 at 12. Cleared for takeoff, runway 27. Cleared for takeoff, 27. November 44 Kilo Delta. He pushed the throttles forward. The Rolls-Royce Pearl engines did not build to power gradually. They arrived at a compression of sound and vibration that Nathan felt in his sternum and along his spine and in the bones of his hands, the aircraft accelerating down the runway with the committed urgency of something that has been waiting for permission to do what it was built to do. Solis gripped the armrest. Nathan's hands were steady. 80 knots. Solis called, his voice catching slightly on the first word and then settling. Check. V1. Nathan's hand came off the throttles, the standard commitment point. Past this speed, the runway behind was no longer an option, and everything that happened next happened in the air. He kept his right hand on the yoke. Rotate. He pulled back, and the Bombardier Global 7500 lifted off the runway at Meridian Aviation Services with a cleanliness that surprised even him. The nose rising to exactly 15 degrees, the gear folding into the wells with 3 clean thumps. The aircraft climbing into the Virginia morning air with the authority of a machine that has been correctly prepared and correctly flown. The transition from ground to sky was flawless in the specific way that only comes from a combination of thousands of hours and the kind of instinct that no simulator session and no classroom and no check ride can fully produce or fully test. Solis stopped breathing for approximately 4 seconds. Then he remembered that he had responsibilities and started again. 30 feet below on the apron, Frank Decker stood beside Diana Marsh and watched the aircraft climb until it entered the base of a cloud deck at 4,000 feet and disappeared. The sound of the engines persisted for another several seconds after the aircraft was gone, a diminishing pressure in the air, and then silence. Frank cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I pulled a bit more on Cole's record while you were... Tell me. He wasn't just type-rated." Frank was choosing his words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. "He was a military test pilot, Air Force, Edwards Air Force Base, 6 years. His clearance level and most of his flight record are classified above what the public registry shows, but what's available..." He paused. "What's available indicates he was considered among the best they had." Diana said nothing. She was still looking at the sky where the aircraft had been. "There's also a notation," Frank continued. "An incident report 11 years ago, a test flight above the Mojave. His wingman was killed, a Lieutenant Drew Calloway, 26 years old. After the investigation closed, Cole submitted his resignation and disappeared from the aviation community entirely." Frank stopped. "He's been working in our maintenance bay for 3 years. Diana turned to look at Frank. It was the first time she'd fully looked at anyone in the last 10 minutes, and the expression she wore was not one her staff had seen before. Not anger, not calculation, but something quieter and considerably more complicated. The look of a woman who has just discovered she's been standing next to something significant and mistook it for ordinary scenery. 3 years, she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Right here." "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to the sky. The cloud deck had closed. There was nothing to see. "What have I done?" she said. And it wasn't a question in the way questions are usually questions. It was the sound of a person conducting a private accounting and not being satisfied with the result. Nobody answered. The maintenance crew had filtered back inside. The fuelers had returned to their trucks. The hangar resumed its rhythm the way machinery resumes rhythm, without acknowledgement, without ceremony, because the work doesn't stop for what just happened any more than it stops for anything else. At 37,000 feet, Nathan leveled the aircraft and engaged the autopilot. The sky above the weather was the particular blue that exists at cruising altitude, and nowhere else a blue with depth to it, not the shallow blue of a clear afternoon, but the blue of genuine altitude, the color of the upper atmosphere seen from inside it. It was the blue that had for 12 years made Nathan feel like the rules of ordinary life didn't apply up here, the same blue that had been the last thing visible through Ace Calloway's canopy. He stared at the instrument panel instead. Solis had retrieved his phone during the climb, and Nathan had known that was going to happen and had let it happen because there are some things you can't stop and there are some things that don't need stopping. "Sir." Solis's voice had a different quality now, careful the way voices get when they've found something they're not sure how to present. "I looked you up while we were climbing." "I know. You flew the X-47B. Among other things." A pause. Below them, Virginia had given way to whatever came next, the geometry of roads and suburbs becoming abstract at this altitude. "Why are you fixing hydraulic fittings?" Nathan was quiet long enough that Solis might have thought the question was being declined. Then, "Because my son needs a father who comes home every night, not a flag and a folded letter." Solis absorbed this. The autopilot held their course without assistance. The radios handed them off from one sector to the next in the routine progression of controlled airspace, and Nathan acknowledged each handoff with the standard phraseology, his voice unchanged. "He was 26, Nathan said after a while. Not to Solis exactly. In the direction of the forward windscreen where the blue went on without end. "His name was Drew. Everyone called him Ace because he said it was bad luck not to have a nickname. He used to say the sky wasn't the ceiling, it was the starting line. A beat. One day I couldn't keep him safe. Solis said the only honest thing available to him, "I'm sorry, sir." Nathan nodded once. "So am I." They flew. The engines held their note. The autopilot made small, imperceptible adjustments to maintain altitude and heading. Nathan reached into the chest pocket of his jumpsuit and took out a photograph worn soft at the creases. The color faded the way photographs fade when they've been handled for long enough that the handling becomes part of the object. Two men in flight suits standing in front of an aircraft that most people would never see, and that he couldn't describe to anyone who didn't already know what it was. Both of them grinning. Both of them young enough to believe that their skill was armor. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Put it away. "Solis?" "Sir?" "You have 400 hours. That's essentially nothing." He said it without cruelty, the way you state a fact that needs stating. "But it's a beginning. Keep your hands on the controls and your eyes on the instruments, and I'll teach you something today." Solis straightened in his seat with the posture of someone who has been told they're going to be allowed to try. "Yes, sir." "Read me the descent checklist. We have a CEO to deliver." The bombardier touched down at Dulles with the kind of landing that made Solis grip the armrest and then release it immediately, embarrassed by the reflex. No float. No bounce. The mains kissed the runway with a firmness that communicated precision rather than force the touchdown of a pilot who knows exactly where the aircraft is in 3 dimensions at every moment of the approach and who has placed it exactly where it needed to be. Solis exhaled. That was, "Your altitude callouts floated on final. You called 500 feet after I'd already registered it. In a 2-pilot cockpit, that gap matters." "Yes, sir. I'll work on it." "You will, because the next time I may not be in this seat." He taxied the aircraft to the private terminal ramp and ran the shutdown sequence with the same methodical precision he'd applied to every other phase of the flight. When the engines wound down and the cockpit fell quiet, he sat still for a moment in the left seat. Just one moment, eyes closed, hands on his thighs, and let himself feel the wholeness of it. The completeness of a flight correctly flown from the first checklist item to the last. The thing he'd spent 10 years telling himself he didn't miss. He opened his eyes and stood up. Outside on the ramp, the Virginia heat was a different animal than the morning cool they'd departed into. A black town car sat at the terminal entrance with its engine running, and Diana Marsh was stepping out of it before Nathan reached the bottom of the stairs. She had changed during the flight, or something had changed, which is not quite the same thing. The sharp-edged urgency that had driven her through the hangar that morning was still there, still structuring the way she moved and held herself, but the surface of it was different. She walked toward Nathan and stopped at a distance that was closer than she'd been at Meridian, and she studied him the way she had studied him in the hangar, with the full attention of someone conducting a genuine assessment, but the assessment itself seemed to have a different object. "We made it," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "The meeting is in 40 minutes. "Then you should go." She didn't go. She stood on the ramp in the dullest heat with her phone in her hand and her schedule pressing against every second, and she looked at him like someone trying to understand how they missed something that in retrospect should have been obvious. "Frank sent me your file during the flight. Frank talks too much." "You were a test pilot. Edwards Air Force Base. Past tense. Your clearance level was higher than most generals." "Was." He told me about the accident. The muscle in Nathan's cheek moved. The same small, involuntary motion, the same briefly visible evidence of something kept carefully out of reach. "Frank really does talk too much," he said, quiet enough that the words had weight. Diana took half a step forward. She was accustomed to the leverage that proximity and attention provide, had built most of her professional relationships on the understanding that sustained eye contact from someone in her position is inherently a form of pressure. Nathan met her eyes the way he met everything, without the performance of being unbothered, which would be its own kind of reaction, but with the genuine stillness of someone who has faced things that make this moment relatively manageable. Why didn't you say something when I asked if anyone could fly? Why did you let me humiliate you first? You didn't humiliate me, ma'am. You asked a question. I answered it. I mocked you in front of your colleagues. I've been mocked before. It doesn't change what I can do." She held his gaze. Diana Marsh was not a person who apologized. She'd operated her entire professional life on the understanding that apology is a form of admission, and admission is a form of weakness, and weakness invites exploitation. And she had survived 2 hostile acquisition attempts and the collapse of a market segment that took several of her competitors down with it by maintaining that understanding without exception. But something about this man, the absolute absence of performance in him, the way he occupied the space he was in without any apparent awareness of or interest in how that looked to anyone watching, made her want to find a word she didn't normally reach for. "I underestimated you," she said. "That's not something I do often." "Everyone does it. I make it easy." "Why?" Nathan looked past her at the town car, at the driver, standing with his hands folded at the terminal building behind him, where people with meetings were moving toward their meetings. "Because I'm not trying to be seen Ms. Marsh. I'm trying to raise my kid." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, the reflex of someone whose attention is permanently divided. Then she looked back at him. "This conversation isn't finished." "It is for me." She turned and walked to the car. The door closed behind her and the town car moved, and Nathan stood on the ramp and watched it go around the corner of the terminal until it wasn't visible anymore. The heat pressed down on him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. 2 texts from Eli sent during school hours in violation of at least 3 classroom rules. "Dad, are you coming home for dinner?" And then 2 minutes later, "I made a new airplane. This one has wings like a real jet." Nathan typed back, "I'll be home. Save me a seat and save that airplane. We're testing it tonight." 3 rocket emojis. He put the phone away and went back up the stairs to handle the post-flight log, because the flight wasn't finished until the paperwork was finished, and he had never in his career decided that paperwork was optional. Solis was waiting at the bottom of the stairs when Nathan came back down, logbook in hand, with the look of someone who has been assembling a question for the entire duration of the post-flight. "Sir, you always have a question. When we get back to Meridian, what happens, I mean, for you? Are you going back to the maintenance bay?" "That's where my tools are." Solis shook his head slowly. "After what happened today..." "What happened today was an emergency. I helped out. That's all it was. I've trained with captains who have 10 times your hours logged in civilian aircraft. None of them fly like you." Nathan reached for the stair railing. "Hours don't make a pilot. Judgment does. And my judgment told me 10 years ago that my son needed me on the ground more than anyone needed me in the sky." He looked at Solis, at the young man's face, which still carried the slightly stunned expression it had worn since the departure roll, the look of someone who has encountered something that doesn't fit inside the categories they'd previously assigned to the world. "He's 9 years old. He waves at me from the school bus every morning. That's not nothing, Solis. That's everything." Solis was quiet for a moment. "He's lucky." "No." Nathan's voice didn't change, but something in it settled the way something settles when it finds the ground it was looking for. "I'm lucky. He's the best thing I ever did, the only mission I never failed." They flew back to Meridian in the late afternoon light, the Chesapeake Bay visible to the east in the gaps between weather systems, the suburban sprawl of Northern Virginia spreading below them in the organized chaos that always looks from altitude like it might be comprehensible if you could just get high enough. Solis ran the radios under Nathan's supervision, and Nathan corrected him twice, once on a readback, once on his call-out timing, and Solis accepted both corrections without defense, which was its own kind of information about what kind of aviator he might become. Nathan gave him the landing. It wasn't perfect. A slight sideward drift corrected a half-second late, a touchdown that was firm where it should have been smooth, but it was safe, and it was controlled. And when Nathan gave him a single nod afterward, Solis understood that the nod was not consolation. It was an acknowledgement that something real had happened. They shut down. Nathan signed off the flight records, handed Solis the pen for his entries, and was at the bottom of the stairs and moving toward the maintenance bay before Solis had finished writing. He didn't look at the operations building. He didn't stop for the fuelers who wanted to ask him things, or the mechanics who were watching him with the recalibrated attention of people encountering a familiar object in an unfamiliar context. He walked back to his tools the same way he'd walked away from them, which is to say, with purpose and without theater. The bay was different, though. He'd known it would be. The looks had weight to them now, not the casual indifference of the morning or the brief flickers of acknowledgement that constitute the social economy of a maintenance environment, but genuine, sustained attention, the kind that comes when the story people have been telling themselves about someone has just been substantially revised. Danny caught up to him near the roll-up door. "Reed, is it true you actually flew it? Left seat?" "I brought it back in one piece." "Harlow's been saying you probably just watched from the jump seat." "Harlow can say what Harlow wants." "But it's not true." Nathan stopped and looked at the kid. 23 years old, still believing that doing good work, eventually got noticed, still in possession of the useful illusion that the world is roughly fair. "Left seat," Nathan confirmed. "Now go back to work. You should too." He found his toolbox where he'd left it. His coffee was cold on the break-room table, undisturbed by his absence, which was its own minor comment on his invisibility in this place. He poured it down the drain, refilled from the pot, and opened his afternoon work orders. 3 routine inspections, 1 brake overhaul, a navigation light replacement on a King Air that had been logged and deferred and was now overdue. Normal, ordinary, invisible. He liked it that way. At 4:15, Frank appeared in the bay doorway with the expression of a man carrying a message he'd rather be carrying somewhere else to someone else under different circumstances. Nathan recognized the expression before Frank had said anything because Frank's face was not built for concealment. "Reed, got a minute?" "I've got a nav light that needs my minute." "This is more important." Nathan set down the housing bracket and looked at Frank directly. "What?" "Hale called from D.C. She wants to see you tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, her office." The silence between them had texture. "No. Cole, I flew her aircraft. The job is done. I'm not interested in a meeting." Frank rubbed the back of his neck with the motion of a man who has already had this argument with himself and lost. When Ms. Marsh asks to see someone, that person shows up. That's how it works here. That's how it works for people who need this job more than they need their self-respect. Frank let that land. Then, "You do need this job. You've got a kid and $11 an hour isn't much, but it's what's between you and a problem you don't want." He said it without pleasure. 8 o'clock, 3rd floor of the ops building. Wear something that doesn't have grease on it." "I'll wear what I wear." Frank almost smiled, the reluctant kind. "Of course you will." He turned to go, stopped. "Whatever she wants, it's not nothing, Cole. A woman like that doesn't call someone like you for nothing." Nathan went back to the nav light housing. He worked until his shift ended, and then he worked slightly past it because the King Air wasn't finished, and a nav light that wasn't working was a nav light that would eventually be involved in something bad, and he had never in 22 years around aircraft decided that a job worth starting was acceptable to leave incomplete. He picked up Eli from Mrs. Patterson's house 4 blocks from their apartment. Mrs. Patterson was 70 years old and smelled like lavender and oatmeal cookies, and had opinions about nearly everything that she expressed with the certainty of someone who had lived long enough to be confident in her conclusions. She met Nathan at the door. "He's been designing aircraft in my kitchen since 3:30, she said. "I suggested he try a boat instead, and he told me that boats don't have the same thrust-to-weight considerations." "That's my boy." Eli appeared from the hallway at a velocity suggesting he'd been waiting for the door to open since about 3:45. He was carrying a paper airplane with the reverence of someone transporting something they're proud of and know to be fragile. "Dad, look, I added winglets." Nathan crouched down and took the aircraft carefully, the way you handle something someone built with intention. He turned it over. The winglet geometry was correct, the angle of cant, The span the way they were formed to reduce induced drag at the tips, and there was no universe in which a 9-year-old arrived at correct winglet geometry by random paper folding. Where did you learn about winglets? YouTube. There's a channel about how planes work. Did you know they can reduce drag by up to 5%? I did know that. How? Nathan handed the airplane back. Lucky guess. Come on, let's go home and test this thing. The apartment was small in the way that apartments become small when they're the right size for one person and somewhat less than the right size for two. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that doubled as a dining room when the table was clear, and a staging area for whatever project was currently in progress when it wasn't. The walls were mostly bare except for Eli's work drawings tacked up in a pattern that had long since abandoned any pretense of organization, airplanes and rockets, and one portrait of Nathan that depicted him with a wrench in one hand and what appeared to be a determined expression rendered in the particular style of a child artist who is more interested in conveying essence than achieving likeness. Nathan made dinner, pasta with meat sauce simple enough to do with one part of his brain, while the other part registered the sound of Eli at the kitchen counter doing homework and occasionally asking questions that had nothing to do with homework. Dad, what did you do today? Nathan stirred the sauce. He thought about the throttles in his hands, the aircraft lifting beneath him like it recognized him, the specific sensation forgotten and then unforgotten of being at altitude in the left seat with everything working correctly and the sky opening in every direction and the ground with all its complications temporarily irrelevant. Worked on some planes, he said. Same as always. Anything cool? Not really. Regular day. Eli went back to his math. Nathan watched him for a moment, the bent head, the pencil moving with the focused inefficiency of a child who is thinking harder than the problem requires, and something moved in his chest. Not pain and not regret, but the particular weight of a choice made long ago, made freely, made again every morning without hesitation, and still carrying exactly the gravity it always had. After dinner, they tested the airplane in the hallway. Eli threw it 6 times. It flew straight each time, the winglets doing precisely what winglets are designed to do, and on the 7th throw Nathan caught it at the far end and held it up in the light. Dad, I want to be a pilot when I grow up. Nathan looked at the airplane. He looked at the way the light came through the paper where the folds overlapped. You can be anything you want. I want to be a pilot like the ones at your airport. Are they good? They're good. Are you better? The question arrived from a direction he hadn't prepared for. He looked at his son, at those direct, unguarded eyes that hadn't yet been taught to approach certain subjects sideways, that hadn't learned yet how the thing you love can become the thing you're afraid of, that still believed that the world was mostly continuous with the way it appeared. I'm just a mechanic, buddy. But Mrs. Patterson says people can be more than one thing. She says we have layers. Mrs. Patterson is a smart lady. So are you more than one thing? Nathan looked at the paper airplane in his hand for a moment. Then he crouched down to Eli's eye level and held it out. The other thing is the guy who's going to teach you to build a better airplane than this one. Go get paper, the thick kind from the printer. Eli's face rearranged itself into pure forward motion. He was at the desk and back in 11 seconds with a stack of paper held like an offering, and they sat on the living room floor for the next hour while Nathan showed him the delta wing fold, the nose weight adjustment, the trailing edge modification that creates the pitch-up moment a stable glide requires. Eli's hands followed Nathan's with a precision that was startling and a focus that was absolute, and when the new design flew twice the distance of the original, Eli made a sound that 11-year-old boys are better at and 9-year-old boys still allow themselves. They cleaned up, and Nathan put Eli to bed at 8:30. He read 2 chapters of a book about a kid who builds a rocket from salvaged parts in his uncle's garage. By the end of the 2nd chapter, Eli was under breathing, with the deep, even rhythm of a child who goes to sleep in a world where the things that should be reliable are reliable. Nathan sat on the edge of the bed for a while. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments are quiet when the work of the day is done and there's nothing left between you and whatever is waiting in the less occupied parts of your mind. He went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, stood at the window where the parking lot lights made a kind of amber geography below, and the sky above was the flat suburban orange of a night with too much light pollution to show what it actually was. His phone was on the table. He picked it up and opened his contacts and scrolled until he found a name he hadn't called in years: General Howard Pruitt, retired, his commanding officer at Edwards, the man who had overseen Nathan's career from his first assignment to his last, who had stood in a hospital room in Palmdale 11 years ago and said words that Nathan had been unable to receive at the time and had spent 10 years declining to revisit. He stared at the name. Tomorrow there was a meeting with Diana Marsh, a woman who had looked at him like he was scenery and now wanted something from him, and he didn't know what it was, and he told himself he didn't particularly care, which was at least partially true. Whatever she offered would have to fit around the only job that actually mattered, the one currently asleep at the end of the hall with a paper airplane on the nightstand. He put the phone down without dialing. He turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment. Somewhere above the light pollution, above the orange haze, above the cloud deck they'd climbed through. That morning the sky was doing what it always did, indifferent to what happened below it, unchanged by who was or wasn't up in it. He could almost feel the altitude, the way the seat takes your weight, and the instruments arrange themselves in your vision, and the ground gets smaller until it stops being the primary fact of existence. Almost. He turned away from the window and walked to his bedroom, set his alarm for 5 o'clock the same as every morning, lay down, and for the first time in 10 years before he'd decided to allow it, the dream came without being invited. The alarm went off at 5, and Nathan was already awake, had been awake for the better part of an hour, lying in the dark, running an argument with himself that had no clean resolution. One side of it said, go hear her out, maintain the employment that keeps the lights on, and Eli and school supplies, and the refrigerator functional. The other side said, stay in the bay, where the past stays buried under grease and procedure, and the reliable anonymity of work that nobody photographs or celebrates or asks you to explain. He'd been having versions of this argument since Frank delivered the message, and the argument wasn't settling the way arguments settle when one side is actually right. He got up, showered, stood in front of the open closet. The 2 work jumpsuits hung on the left, organized by condition, the one with the repaired knee seam for jobs that required kneeling, the backup for everything else. 3 flannel shirts on the right, 2 pairs of jeans, and at the far end, still sealed in the dry cleaning bag from Eli's school picture day 6 months ago, a white button-down shirt that Nathan had purchased for that occasion and worn for approximately 4 hours before returning to what he normally wore. He reached for the nearest jumpsuit, stopped, looked at the white shirt, reached past the jumpsuits and pulled it off the hanger. It was tight across the shoulders in the way that clothes purchased for a person who doesn't quite inhabit his own body yet tend to be tight. Nathan had been a leaner man at Eli's school picture day, still somewhere in the transition between the physical build of someone who spent his days in cockpits and the build of someone who spent them in confined spaces doing manual labor, and the shirt reflected an intermediate version of himself that no longer entirely applied. He tucked it in, looked at the result in the bathroom mirror, and nearly laughed at what he saw. The grease in the creases of his knuckles wasn't going anywhere, regardless of how many times he'd scrubbed them the night before. His hands looked like what they were, and the white shirt looked like something borrowed from a version of his life that hadn't fully committed to existing. He untucked the shirt, rolled the sleeves to his elbows, and decided that was as honest a presentation as the situation was going to get. Eli was still asleep when Nathan made breakfast: 2 eggs scrambled, 1 piece of toast, a glass of orange juice. He left everything on the counter with a note taped to the juice glass: bus at 7:15. Don't forget your lunch. Love, Dad. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and listened to the apartment breathe the particular silence of a place where someone small and important was still dreaming, and then he picked up his keys and went out. The drive to Meridian took 14 minutes. He parked in his usual spot, 3rd row from the fence, same position he'd occupied every working day for 3 years, close enough to the gate that he could make it to the fence by 6:15 without obviously rearranging his morning. He sat in the truck with the engine off for a moment. 5:45. He was 2 hours early for the meeting, which meant he had time to do something useful, which was the only acceptable condition under which he was willing to spend 2 hours at a facility where he was about to walk into a conversation he hadn't decided how to have. He changed into his jumpsuit over the white shirt in the locker room. The shirt would survive it probably, and took the King Air nav light job that had been sitting in his queue since yesterday. He worked in the familiar silence of early morning, replacing the burned housing, checking the wiring runs for corrosion, running the test sequence twice because once was what the procedure required and twice was what Nathan required, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered to him in a way he'd never successfully articulated to anyone who hadn't already understood it. At 7:30, Brett Harlow walked in. Harlow had the particular energy of someone who arrived places already in motion, already positioned within a narrative about himself that the location was expected to confirm. 3,000 hours in his logbook type ratings on the mid-range jets, 4 years at Marsh Aviation that he'd leveraged into the informal status of senior pilot by the simple method of behaving consistently as though the status were official. He was talented. Nathan had registered that from the beginning, the way you register anything that's accurate, regardless of whether you find it convenient, but talent in Harlow was inseparable from the machinery Harlow had built around talent, which was considerably less useful than the talent itself. He leaned against the workbench with his arms crossed, which was how Harlow stood when he wanted to communicate ease while doing something that wasn't easy. "Heard you've got a meeting with the boss lady this morning." Nathan kept his attention on the nav light housing. "News travels." "Small airport." A pause calibrated to suggest that what followed was casual. "So, what's the play?" "She's going to give you a gold star for yesterday." "I don't know what she wants." "I do." Harlow's voice had the texture of someone offering a theory they've already decided is correct. "She feels bad about what she said in the hangar. You bailed her out. Now she's got the guilt and she needs to resolve it, so she makes a gesture and everybody feels better and things go back to normal. Maybe a bonus. Maybe new boots." Nathan set down the housing bracket and looked at Harlow for the first time since he'd come in. There was no hostility in the look, which was its own kind of statement. Hostility would have given Harlow something to work with. "Is there something you actually need?" Harlow's smile tightened at the edges. "Just curious. How a mechanic ends up with more type ratings than half the pilots on this field." "I read a lot." "Sure." Harlow pushed off the workbench, rearranging his posture into something that wanted to read as departure, but wasn't quite there yet. "You know what? I think you're one of those guys who washed out of something and landed here. Cargo, maybe. Or one of those schools in Florida that hands out ratings like change." Nathan stood up from where he'd been crouching beside the King Air's landing light assembly. The motion was unhurried, fully extended, and when he was at full height, the geometry of the room changed in the minor but significant way that geometry changes when the largest object in it reorients. Harlow's weight shifted backward by approximately half a step, the involuntary repositioning of a person whose body has registered something before their mind has caught up. "You can think whatever you want." Nathan's voice carried no particular edge, which somehow made it carry more. "But I'd be careful about saying it loud. Because the next time Ms. Marsh needs a qualified pilot on short notice, you already know who she's going to call, and it isn't going to be you." Harlow's face went through several phases. He opened his mouth, reconsidered whatever he'd intended to say, and walked out of the maintenance bay without the exit he'd scripted for himself. Nathan watched him go without satisfaction. Harlow was noise the background frequency of a man measuring himself against others because he was afraid of what he'd find if he measured himself against himself, and then went back to the nav light. At 7:50, he stripped off the jumpsuit, hung it on the hook, and crossed the tarmac toward the operations building in the white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. The morning air had the particular quality of Virginia August, before the heat had fully committed warm, already thickening toward the day's intent. He felt every eye in the lobby when he pushed through the front doors, the receptionist's gaze doing a small double-take when it registered his hands against the white fabric of his shirt. Nathan Cole, 8 o'clock with Ms. Marsh. The receptionist checked her screen. Something in her expression shifted. "Third floor. Her assistant will meet you at the elevator." "I'll take the stairs." Diana Marsh's executive assistant was waiting in the third-floor hallway with the composed attentiveness of someone who has been briefed on the morning's unusual scheduling. She led him to the corner office without unnecessary conversation, knocked once on the double doors, opened them and stepped aside. Diana Marsh was standing behind her desk. Not sitting, standing, as though she'd calculated that having him find her seated when he entered would seed something she wasn't prepared to seed, or perhaps simply because she'd been standing for the 20 minutes before he arrived and hadn't decided to stop. She was wearing a different version of the same precision she always wore: the dark suit, the controlled posture, the face that communicated competence without warmth, in the way that some architecture communicates strength without invitation. The door clicked shut behind Nathan. They looked at each other across 12 feet of office and 4 seconds of silence that told him several things. "Sit down," she said. "I'll stand." "Please sit." "I'll stand, Ms. Marsh. This won't take long." Her mouth pressed into a line. He observed, already learned something about him in the last 24 hours, that direct pressure didn't produce the results pressure usually produced. She came around the desk and leaned against the front of it, closing the distance by 6 feet, which was the kind of spatial move that works on most people and which Nathan noted without being moved by it. "I'll get to the point," she said. "I need a director of flight operations, someone with the currency and the certification to fly everything in my fleet, someone with the experience to manage complex situations in the air and the judgment to build a training pipeline that actually prepares my pilots for what they're going to encounter, someone who reports directly to me." She paused for one beat. "200,000 a year, full benefits, health coverage for you and your son, retirement plan, flexible scheduling." The number landed in Nathan's chest and stayed there. He'd been making $22,000 a year for 3 years, and he was not naive enough to pretend that the distance between those figures was abstract. $200,000 was Eli's college fund. It was a house with a yard instead of an apartment where the upstairs neighbor practiced guitar at 11 o'clock on weeknights. It was the kind of financial ground under his feet that he hadn't felt since he wore a uniform, the kind that made the future feel less like something to be managed and more like something that might actually arrive in reasonable condition. He kept his face still. "That's generous." "It's not generous. It's what the position pays. I don't do charity." She held his eyes. "What does the day-to-day look like to you?" "I'd need to know what the day-to-day actually looks like before I could answer that. What I saw from 3 years in your maintenance bay isn't a complete picture, but it's more complete than what you have from up here." Something moved in Diana Marsh's expression. Not offense, which he'd expected, but a kind of arrested attention, the pause of someone who has just heard phrasing that requires more than a surface response. "Go on." "When I'm in Chicago or Dallas overnight, who's with my son?" The pause that followed was the kind that reveals the shape of what someone hasn't thought about. Diana Marsh could model a fleet acquisition in her head during a phone call, could hold the financial architecture of a $400 million federal contract in working memory while running 3 parallel conversations. But the specific logistical texture of a 9-year-old's after-school hours was not a variable she'd built into this morning's proposal. "We can work around your schedule," she said. "I'm not unreasonable. With respect, Ms. Marsh, 24 hours ago, you were screaming at your entire crew because one pilot had a cardiac event and you had no contingency. That's not a scheduling problem. That's a leadership problem." He said it the way he said everything he meant, without decoration, without apology, without the softening that makes difficult observations easier to hear and therefore easier to dismiss. "You asked me what the day-to-day looks like. I'll tell you what I know." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet. Not the executive assessment or the controlled authority or the residue of yesterday's anger, something more undefended than any of those. "Go on," she said again, and it surprised her. He could see that it surprised her that the words came out sounding like she meant them. "You have 12 aircraft and not enough qualified pilots to fly them safely. Your maintenance crews are working double shifts for wages that don't match the responsibility they're carrying. A tired mechanic making $11 an hour is the same liability as a tired pilot, just at a different stage of the operation. Your safety reporting system is a form that nobody reads. Your training program puts junior pilots in seats they're not ready for and calls it experience. He stopped. I've been listening to this facility talk to itself for 3 years. The guy fixing the landing gear hears everything. The office held the silence for a moment. Diana had moved sometime in the last 2 minutes from leaning against the desk to standing straight, the shift of someone receiving information that requires a different posture. She walked back around to her chair and sat down, not for any tactical reason, but because she needed the additional second the motion provided. "If I gave you the authority to change what you're describing," she said carefully, "what would that look like? First, maintenance pay goes up 15% effective immediately. The people keeping your $60 million machines in the air are the last line of every safety calculation you make. Pay them like it." He didn't wait for a reaction. "Second, you build a real training pipeline. Solis has 400 hours, and he was slotted as first officer on a global. That's reckless. He needs structured time in smaller aircraft with qualified captains before he touches a heavy jet, and the upgrade path needs to be earned, not assigned." He watched her face. "Third, your safety reporting system becomes something people actually use, which means it becomes something people aren't afraid to use. Right now, your crew chief has been running 16-hour rotations for 6 months because you cut maintenance staffing to hit a budget number. He's not going to file a report that draws attention to a problem if he thinks the attention is going to land on him." Diana's hands were folded on the desk. She was very still. "How do you know about the staffing cuts?" "Carl Whitman told me over coffee 14 months ago. He didn't know he was telling me anything important. He thought he was just talking to another guy on the floor." Nathan met her eyes. "Nobody tells the maintenance team things. They tell each other things. And a lot of what they tell each other is things management would very much like to know." The silence that followed was a different quality from the silences that had come before it. This one had weight and thought moving through it. Diana Marsh had spent 9 years building this company through the application of intelligence and will, and an absolute refusal to let sentiment interfere with decision-making. And the most honest assessment of its operational failures she had ever received had just arrived from a man in a rolled-sleeve dress shirt with engine grease permanently embedded in his hands. "You're asking me to restructure the entire operation," she said. "You asked what I'd change. I told you. Whether you do it is your decision." He paused. "But if you want me in that role, the changes aren't negotiable. And I need them in writing. Not a handshake, a contract with specific terms for my authority, my schedule, and the treatment of every crew member on this field. I know how power works. People make promises when they need something and break them when they don't." Diana stood up. The controlled surface came back into her voice, the professional temperature dropping back to its operational baseline. "You're asking me to sign a legally binding commitment based on one emergency flight and a conversation that's been going on for 10 minutes. I'm asking you to sign it based on 3 years of watching your company from the inside out." He held her gaze. "You can say no. There are other maintenance positions. Get out of my office." Nathan nodded. No performance in it, not wounded, not surprised. He turned toward the door with the same unhurried movement he brought to everything. "Friday." Her voice came from behind him, lower than before, stripped of the executive register. "I'll have legal draft something by Friday." He stopped with his hand on the door handle. "Not something. What I described. All of it, including the maintenance pay." A silence that lasted longer than any of the others. Then, "Friday." He walked out through the hallway, down the stairs, through the lobby. Outside the tarmac, heat had arrived at its full intention. He crossed toward the maintenance bay without stopping for anyone because the conversation was over and he had a King Air nav light to finish. What he didn't see standing at her third-floor window was Diana Marsh watching him cross the tarmac. She stood there longer than she'd have admitted to watching the way he moved, the same way he'd moved across the hangar floor yesterday, the same way he moved through every space he occupied with the easy, unhurried certainty of someone who has long since stopped needing to perform a rival. Then Laura knocked and came in with the morning's actual problem, a contract dispute on one of the mid-Atlantic routes, a client threatening to walk a situation requiring her immediate attention. She turned from the window, but before she did, she opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the one that held the folder she'd built over the past 18 hours, the FAA records, and the redacted incident report, and the chain of documentation that described the career of Nathan James Cole in the language of official records, and placed her hand on the closed folder for a moment. Then she shut the drawer and went back to work. That afternoon, Nathan picked up Eli from Mrs. Patterson's, and they walked the 4 blocks home in the specific, companionable silence of two people who don't need to fill the space between them. Eli had made another airplane, this one a swept-wing design he called the Mark II, and he carried it with the two-handed care of someone transporting a completed thing that deserves not to be destroyed before it's been tested. How was school? Normal. Jackson said that pilots aren't as cool as astronauts because astronauts go further. What did you say? I said pilots go further more often. Nathan considered this. That's a reasonable argument. I know. Eli was quiet for half a block. Dad, did you do anything different today? Had a meeting. With who? A woman who runs the company. Eli processed this in the way he processed things that interested him, not immediately but thoroughly, letting it run behind whatever else he was doing. They'd reached the apartment stairs before he came back to it. Is she nice? Nathan thought about Diana Marsh standing at the front of her desk, pushing through 12 feet of office as though proximity was leverage. He thought about the folder in her drawer, the one she'd built overnight from public records and the fragments of a classified history she couldn't fully access. He thought about the way her voice had changed in that final moment, not softened exactly, but stripped of something that had been layered over the actual sound of it. She's complicated, he said. Most people who've built something real are. Eli accepted this without further questions, which was one of the things Nathan found most remarkable about his son, the instinctive understanding that some answers are complete even when they're not simple. They tested the Mark II in the hallway after dinner. The swept wing produced a different flight characteristic from the Delta, faster, less stable, requiring a more precise throw to achieve a clean glide. Eli threw it 9 times and made adjustments after each throw, bending the trailing edge by increments, shifting the nose weight, observing the result with the focused empiricism of someone who has learned that the way to understand a thing is to change one variable at a time. By the 9th throw, the airplane was flying clean. Dad? Eli caught it at the far end of the hall and held it up, examining the underside with his head tilted. Can I ask you something? You always can. Why didn't you ever tell me you could fly? The question arrived without warning, framed with the simple directness that Eli applied to everything he genuinely wanted to know, and Nathan felt the impact of it in a place that most questions didn't reach. Not because it was accusatory, Eli's voice carried curiosity, not complaint, but because the simplicity of it cut past all the architecture Nathan had built around the subject and landed directly on the thing the architecture was built to protect. He crouched down to Eli's level in the hallway the way he'd learned to do in the early years when the height difference made serious conversations feel uneven. That's a good question. Can we sit down for it? They sat on the hallway floor, backs against the wall, the Mark II resting between them. Nathan looked at his son and thought about what Eli was actually asking. Not why Nathan had kept a secret, but why the secret needed to exist in the first place, which was the harder question. When I was younger than you are now, he began, I decided that more than anything I wanted to fly. Not the way passengers fly, I mean really fly, push the machines to what they could actually do. I worked toward that for a long time, and eventually I got there. I flew for the Air Force. Fast planes, high-altitude things most people never get to see from inside. Eli was listening with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that mattered, still focused, not interrupting. I had a partner, a friend. His name was Drew. Nathan paused on the name the way you pause on ground that has given way before. Everyone called him Ace. He was 26, and he was the most naturally gifted aviator I ever flew with, and he believed genuinely completely that he was going to be part of the generation that made it to Mars. What happened to him? His aircraft failed in flight, a component that nobody had caught in inspection, not me, not the ground crew, not the engineers who built it. It broke the way metal breaks when it's been carrying stress too long, and finally can't anymore. And Drew didn't come home. Eli sat with this. His hands were in his lap, the airplane forgotten beside him. Were you there? I was right next to him. I tried to help him get out. I couldn't. Nathan's voice was even the way voices go, even when the subject they're carrying is too heavy for any other register. For a long time after that, I thought it was my fault, that there was something I should have seen or done or been that would have changed it. And I stopped flying because every time I sat in a cockpit I saw Drew and it was... He stopped, started again. It was too much to carry and still do the job right. Is that why you became a mechanic? Partly, and partly because you were coming and I needed to be the kind of person who came home every night. He looked at his son, at the face that held Eli's mother's eyes and Nathan's own jaw, and the particular expression that belonged entirely to Eli himself, the one that said he was processing something larger than its surface, suggested. The job under the planes felt like the right kind of invisible, safe. No one asking questions I didn't want to answer. But you do fly. I looked up Culpeper Airport, and it's not far. Nathan blinked. Eli said this the way he said things he'd researched, not triumphantly, not accusatorially, but with the quiet confidence of someone presenting a fact they've verified. How long have you known? Since last spring. There's a flight school there, and I found a review online that mentioned a Nathan as an instructor. Eli looked at him directly. I didn't say anything because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. Something shifted in Nathan's chest. Not the familiar weight of the kept secret, but something lighter that moved through where the weight had been the particular sensation of being seen by someone who decided not to make an issue of it. His son had known for 5 months and had waited with 9-year-old patience for Nathan to find his way to the conversation. You're a remarkable kid, Nathan said. Anyone ever tell you that? Mrs. Patterson. But she says it about everybody. Not everybody. I've seen the way she looks at Jackson's older brother. Eli almost smiled. Dad, are you going to keep flying like for real? I flew yesterday for real, and I may be starting a different job. At the airport. Still at the airport. Just a different part of it. Eli picked up the Mark II and turned it over in his hands, examining it with the focused attention he'd given it all evening. Ace would probably think that was good. Right. That you flew again. The question landed somewhere deep. Nathan took a breath, the kind of breath that is also a decision, and nodded slowly. Yeah, buddy. I think he would. That night after Eli was in bed, Nathan sat at the kitchen table with his phone and the particular quality of stillness that comes when the day's logistics have been completed and there's nothing left between you and the thing you've been not doing for 11 years. He opened his contacts, found the name General Howard Pruitt, retired. He pressed call. It rang 4 times. 5. On the 6th ring, just as Nathan was constructing the logic of why the call going to voicemail was actually fine, hello. The voice was older than Nathan had been carrying it in his memory, lower, rougher at the edges, the voice of someone past 70 who has kept their authority but set down some of the register it used to occupy. Unmistakable. Nathan's hand tightened on the phone. He ended the call. He sat looking at the screen for a moment, the call log showing the duration 11 seconds. Then he put the phone face down on the table and went to the window. The night sky over Manassas was the particular shade of overcast that hides stars without being dramatic about it. Just a flat, orange-gray ceiling, the city's light bouncing back from the bottom of a cloud deck that stretched in every direction. He stood there long enough that his coffee went cold on the counter behind him, thinking about nothing in a focused way, which is what you do when you're thinking about something you're not ready to think about directly. The following morning he was in the maintenance bay at 5:50 jumpsuit on second coffee of the day, replacing a brake assembly on a Cessna that had been grinding on landing for the past 2 weeks when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Virginia area code, nothing in his contacts. Cole. He answered the way he answered unknown numbers, with his last name and minimal commitment. Nathan. The voice on the other end was the same voice from the 11-second call the night before. This is Howard Pruitt. The brake assembly in Nathan's hands became very still. General. Retired 6 years. Howard's fine. A pause that managed to be comfortable rather than awkward, the pause of someone who has rehearsed nothing and is simply allowing space. You called last night. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Don't apologize for calling. I've been waiting for that call for a long time. Another pause. I heard you flew yesterday. Word moves through the old network faster than you'd expect. It was a one-time thing. It wasn't, and you know it, which is probably why you called. Pruitt's voice was unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who has spent decades speaking to people who needed to hear difficult things and had learned that speed was the enemy of reception. Nathan, I have something I need to send you. A document. I'm going to fax it to the operations building at your facility because that's the only fax number I have for Meridian, and I need you to read it before we talk again. Nathan's attention sharpened. What document? The Mojave Incident Investigation Report. Final version with the metallurgical findings. It was declassified 3 years ago. Pruitt paused. I know you never read it. I know why you never read it. But you need to read it now, Nathan. Not because I'm telling you to, because you flew yesterday and whatever comes next requires you to know what actually happened out there. Not what you've been telling yourself happened. What the data says happened. The brake assembly was still in Nathan's hands. He was aware of it distantly, the way you're aware of things that are physically present when something else is occupying the part of your attention that assigns significance. I don't want to read it, he said. I know you don't. Read it anyway. Pruitt's voice was steady without being hard, the voice of someone who understands the difference between the thing a person wants and the thing they need. I'll call you tonight. The fax arrived at 9:45. Laura from the 3rd floor called down to the maintenance bay to let Nathan know there was something for him at the front desk, her voice carefully neutral in the way voices go when the information being delivered is unusual enough to have attracted attention. Nathan walked to the operations building, signed for the envelope without meeting anyone's eyes, and carried it to the break room. 47 pages. He closed the break room door and read every one of them in the hour he had before his next scheduled inspection. The language was the language of official technical investigation, precise, clinical, stripped of everything except what the evidence could support. The metallurgical analysis was on pages 12 through 19, photomicrographs of the stabilizer actuator component cross-sections showing the fatigue crack in 3 orientations, the progression documentation that established the failure timeline. The crack had been present, invisible to standard inspection methods, invisible to the inspection protocols of that period, invisible to Nathan and to the ground crew and to the engineers who had assembled the aircraft through an unknown number of flight cycles before it propagated to failure on the morning of the accident. The board's finding was unambiguous, stated in the flat declarative language of people who are trained to be unambiguous. The failure was attributable to a manufacturing defect in the original component, manifesting as a subsurface crystalline discontinuity that was not detectable under the inspection regime then in use at Edwards Air Force Base or any comparable facility. No action or inaction on the part of the flight crew contributed to the failure event. The assigned flight lead. Nathan's designation was redacted, replaced with a case identifier, but he knew which paragraphs were his, had responded to the emergency with actions consistent with the highest standard of airmanship, including the decision to remain on station to support the distressed aircraft's crew through the ejection sequence rather than departing the area, a decision that resulted in the flight lead's own ejection at significantly below minimum safe altitude. The ejection altitude documented in the flight data recorder summary on page 31 was 120 feet. Minimum safe altitude for the ejection system was 500 feet. The margin between those two numbers was the margin between the story having a different ending and the story having the ending it had, and Nathan had spent 11 years carrying the version of that math where Drew's death was the outcome of something Nathan had failed to do or failed to see, and what the 47 pages said was that the math was different, had always been different, would have been different even if Nathan had been a better pilot than he was, which the board's supplemental observation on page 43 noted was given the available evidence not obviously possible. He sat in the break room after he finished reading. Someone knocked and opened the door. Danny, looking for coffee, saw Nathan's expression, assess the situation with the instinct of a 23-year-old who has developed a reasonable sensor for when adults need to be left alone, and backed out without speaking. Nathan sat with it for a while. Not the grief exactly. The grief had become familiar enough over 11 years that its presence was almost comfortable, the way a specific ache in an old injury becomes part of your normal physical weather. What he sat with was the recalibration, the mechanical process of revising 11 years of internal accounting to reflect what the evidence had always said, which was that Drew Calloway had died because a piece of metal failed at the atomic level, and Nathan Cole had nearly died trying to bring him home. And the distance between those two facts and the story Nathan had been telling himself was the distance between the truth and the thing we replace truth with when the truth is too clean, and we need the weight of fault to explain why we're still here. Pruitt called that evening as promised at 7:15, after Eli was doing homework at the kitchen counter, and Nathan had stepped out to the small balcony that overlooked the parking lot. "You read it?" "Yes. All of it. Every page." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, the quiet of someone allowing space for what they've just been told to settle. "I should have found a way to make you read it 11 years ago. I tried. You weren't reachable." "I know. What I told you in the hospital, that it wasn't your fault, I meant it then and I mean it now. And the difference is that now there are 47 pages of federal documentation that say the same thing." Pruitt's voice had shifted slightly, still the authority, but something more personal moving underneath it, the register of a man talking to someone he's been worrying about for a long time and is relieved to be talking to at all. "What I should have said then and didn't was this: Drew Calloway was 26 years old and going to Mars, and the reason he believed he could get there was partly because he had spent the 2 years before that accident flying on the wing of someone who showed him every day that the edge of what's possible isn't fixed. He told me that directly, Nathan, the week before the accident. He said, Pruitt Cole is the reason I know I can actually do this. That's what I should have put in front of you in that hospital room." Nathan's hand on the balcony railing tightened without his deciding to tighten it. The parking lot below was empty except for 2 cars, and above the light pollution the sky was doing what it always did, carrying on indifferent, unchanged. "He was already gone," Nathan said. "Whatever I had left to carry, that was mine." "Yes, and you've carried it. 11 years is a long time, Nathan. You've paid. And the question now is whether you're going to spend the next 11 years paying for something that the evidence said you didn't owe." Pruitt paused. "You flew yesterday. You've got an offer on the table from what I understand. And you called me last night, which tells me something has shifted, even if you're not ready to say what." It was 11 seconds. "It was the first call in 11 years. I'll take 11 seconds. There was something in Pruitt's voice now, not quite humor but adjacent to it, the warmth of someone who has been carrying their own version of worry about this situation for a very long time and is feeling it lighten. "Take the job, Nathan, not because Diana Marsh needs you and not because the company needs you, though both of those things are probably true. Take it because Ace Calloway spent 2 years believing the sky had no fixed ceiling because he saw someone prove it every day, and that person is still alive and still flying and still capable of showing someone that the sky has no fixed ceiling. That matters. Don't let it go to waste out of loyalty to a story that the evidence already disproved." Nathan was quiet for a long time. The parking lot, the flat orange sky, the sound from inside of Eli asking a question about fractions that Nathan could hear but not quite make out. "It's not that simple," he said finally. "Of course it's not. It never is." Pruitt's voice was steady. Do it anyway. Friday arrived with the compressed momentum of a week that had too much in it. The legal team produced a contract document that ran to 11 pages and reflected in the careful language of liability management and corporate protection a version of Nathan's terms that was about 70% of what he'd asked for. Nathan read it the way he read everything, completely in sequence with the patient attention of someone for whom the details are not decorative, and returned it to Frank with 3 pages of specific annotations. Frank delivered the annotations to the third floor with the expression of a man who has accepted that his role in this situation is messenger and is making peace with it. He came back 40 minutes later. She wants to talk through 2 of your points directly. Which 2? The maintenance pay provision and the pilot evaluation authority. Nathan looked at Frank across the workbench, then set up the meeting. The second conversation with Diana Marsh was shorter than the first and conducted at a different temperature. She was seated this time, which meant something she'd decided to operate on familiar ground rather than the choreography of the first meeting. He stood across the desk from her, and they worked through the contested language with the efficiency of 2 people who have already established that neither of them is going to yield to pressure, and what remained was the actual substance of the disagreement, which turned out to be navigable once the performance was set aside. The maintenance pay provision stayed. The pilot evaluation authority stayed. The scheduling language, the guarantee that Nathan's hours would allow him to be at the bus stop when Eli got off the school bus, was expanded rather than reduced because Diana had done her math between Monday and Friday and understood that the alternative to this particular constraint was no Nathan Cole at all, and the balance of that calculation was not complicated. When the revised contract came back on Friday afternoon, Nathan read it twice. Then he picked up the pen on Diana's desk and signed on the indicated line. She signed across from him. Their hands did not touch during the exchange of the document. But when the signing was complete and the contract was closed and the thing was done, Diana Marsh looked up from the page and said something, without the executive register, without the calculated composure, in a voice that sounded like the version of her voice that existed before the version trained by 9 years of building something in a difficult industry. "I should have seen you earlier. I'm sorry I didn't." Nathan set the pen down. There was a long beat in which he considered several responses and found most of them inadequate to the sincerity of what she'd said. "You're seeing me now," he said finally. "That'll do." He walked out of her office, down the stairs, across the tarmac to the maintenance bay he'd be leaving on Monday, and finished the afternoon the way he'd finished every afternoon for 3 years, doing the work that was in front of him completely and without ceremony until the shift ended and it was time to go home. That night, after Eli was in bed and the apartment was quiet, Nathan went to the drawer where he kept the photograph. He took it out and held it. Drew Calloway at 26, grinning with the confidence of someone who doesn't yet know the specific shape of what the world can take from you. The 2 of them in front of an aircraft he couldn't name aloud, even now young enough to believe that skill was the same thing as safety. He set the photograph on the kitchen table face up. "I flew yesterday, Ace," he said to the empty kitchen, "and it didn't break me, and Monday I'm going back up." He looked at the photograph for a moment longer. "I'm going to keep going up, not because I forgot you, because I remember." He put the photograph in his chest pocket, the same pocket where it had lived for 11 years, the worn rectangle of it as familiar to his hand as any tool he owned, and went to bed. The alarm was set for 5, the same as always. The same as Monday, when he would walk across the tarmac to a different door, carrying the same hands and the same history, and for the first time in a decade, something that felt less like a weight and more like a compass. Monday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, without fanfare, carrying its weight quietly indistinguishable from any other morning until you were already inside it. Nathan dropped Eli at the bus stop at 7:10. Same corner, same routine, Eli's backpack bouncing as he ran the last 20 feet to where 3 other kids were already waiting. He turned back before climbing the bus steps the way he always turned back, and Nathan gave him the same chin-lift acknowledgement he gave every morning. Then Eli stopped. "Dad, you look different today." "Different how?" Eli considered him with the focused appraisal of someone taking inventory. Like you're going somewhere that matters, not just the airport, a different part of it. Nathan crouched and straightened the left strap of Eli's backpack, which had twisted at the shoulder. Same airport. Get on the bus, detective. But you look... Bus, Eli. Eli went casting one more look over his shoulder from the bottom step that said he wasn't done with the observation, only relocating it to a time when it could be examined properly. The doors closed. Nathan stood on the sidewalk until the bus turned the corner, and then he walked back to his truck. On the passenger seat was a bag he'd packed the night before. Inside it, a white button-down shirt pressed this time that he'd run through the iron twice because the first pass left a crease at the pocket that wasn't right. A pair of dark slacks from the Goodwill on Nokesville Road tried on and examined and found acceptable. A pair of black shoes that had required 40 minutes of work to bring to a shine using polish he'd bought at the same Goodwill, and which now reflected the morning light off their toes in a way that still faintly surprised him every time he looked down. He drove to Meridian, parked in the third row from the fence, the same spot, because some things don't change just because other things do. He carried the bag to the maintenance bay locker room, changed into the slacks and shirt, and stood in front of the scratched mirror above the utility sink for a moment. The grease-stained knuckles were still there, would always be there, the permanent record of 10 years of work that no amount of preparation could fully expunge. But the posture was different from the man who'd stood at that same mirror in a borrowed-looking white shirt 5 days ago. Something behind the eyes had shifted the way a room changes when someone finally turns on a light that's been off long enough that you'd stopped noticing the dark. Frank was the first person he encountered walking out of the bay. Frank looked at him the way you look at something that is technically familiar, but has reorganized itself in ways that require a moment to process. I didn't know you owned dress shoes. I didn't until Saturday. How do they feel? Like someone else's feet. Frank laughed, the short, genuine kind, not the social kind. Then his expression shifted into something more serious, the face of a man who has something to say that matters and isn't sure how to wrap it in the right amount of words. He extended his hand. Nathan took it, a real handshake, the kind where both people are actually present, the kind that acknowledges what's ending and what's beginning without needing to name either one directly. Take care of what's up there, Reed. Those pilots need someone who actually knows what they're doing. You take care of what's down here. Those guys depend on you. I've been taking care of it longer than you've been here. Frank released the handshake and stepped back, and his voice went gruff in the way voices go gruff when they're covering something they don't want to name. Go fly something. Nathan crossed the tarmac toward the operations building with the morning sun already pushing heat off the concrete and the smell of jet fuel hanging in the air, the way it always did, permanent, omnipresent, the specific perfume of a place where machines capable of crossing continents were maintained by people who got up before the sun. He pushed through the front doors and took the stairs to the third floor, and Laura was waiting in the hallway the same as before, but her expression was different. Not the neutral professionalism of someone managing an unusual appointment, but the expression of someone who has been briefed and finds the situation genuinely interesting. Good morning, Mr. Cole. Conference room B. Ms. Marsh is already inside. The conference room had a long table and a wall of glass overlooking the ramp and 6 people seated around it, who all looked at Nathan when he entered with the specific quality of attention that pilots reserve for new authority they haven't yet decided whether to accept. He recognized Solis immediately. The young first officer had the slightly altered look of someone who has spent a week revising his understanding of what a thing is, which is to say, he looked like someone who had encountered Nathan Cole in an emergency and was now encountering him in an entirely different context and was working to reconcile the two. Diana stood at the head of the table. She introduced the assembled pilots with the economy of someone conducting a briefing rather than a social event. Lisa Hartwell, Captain, Gulfstream Fleet, a compact woman in her late 30s with the watchful eyes of someone who has developed strong opinions about what qualifies as adequate airmanship. Derek Hull, Captain, mid-range jets built like a linebacker flying since his early 20s. Sam Wilder, Captain, Similar tenure, quieter than Hull. The type who listened more than he spoke and whose listening had weight to it. Jenny Park, First Officer, 25, the most junior person at the table after Solis, and at the far end with his arms crossed and his expression calibrated to communicate that his arms were crossed as a considered position rather than a reflex, Brett Harlow. "Everyone," Diana said. "This is Nathan Cole, your new Director of Flight Operations. His authority covers pilot training, standardization, route assignments, and crew scheduling effective today. I expect full cooperation." Harlow uncrossed and recrossed his arms, which accomplished nothing except demonstrating that he was thinking about what he wanted to say. "I've been flying for this company for 4 years. I've got more hours than anyone at this table." He paused for exactly the right length of time for the implication to be clear. "We're supposed to take operational direction from a mechanic." The room tightened. Hull looked at the table. Park looked at Solis. Solis looked at his hands. Nathan didn't answer immediately. He let the silence do its work not as a tactic, but because he'd learned over many years that the instinct to fill silence is almost always wrong. He looked at Harlow directly, not with hostility, and not with the performance of patience, but with the level attention of someone who has decided this conversation is worth having and intends to have it correctly. "You're right about the hours," Nathan said. "That experience is real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't." Harlow's expression shifted fractionally. He'd expected a deflection or a defense and received neither. "But a logbook tells me where you've been. It doesn't tell me how you respond when the weather at your alternate goes below minimums and you're at fuel reserve, or how you manage a crew that's been on duty 14 hours and is making the kind of small errors that accumulate. Those things I'll learn from flying with you, which I intend to do starting this week with every pilot in this room." "Check rides." Hull said it flatly, neither objecting nor endorsing, just naming the thing. "Proficiency evaluations, oral component systems review, and a check ride. Every pilot, including me, I'll fly right seat with whoever wants to evaluate my currency, and if I don't meet standard, I'll tell you." Nathan looked around the table. "This isn't about finding out who's inadequate. It's about knowing what this team can actually do, so when something goes wrong at altitude, and something will eventually because it always does, nobody is discovering anyone else's limitations for the first time at the worst possible moment." Harlow's jaw tightened. "I'm type-rated and current. I don't need someone running a check ride who was changing my brake pads last week." "Your type rating was issued 3 years ago." Nathan's voice didn't change registers. "Currency requires recurrent training. When was your last formal proficiency evaluation, Harlow?" The silence that followed was the specific silence of someone who has asked a question they expected to control and discovered they've handed control to someone else. Harlow's eyes moved briefly and then came back to Nathan's face without the answer. "The company didn't require one," he said. "I know. That ends today." Nathan looked at Diana, who had been observing from the head of the table with the expression of someone watching a process she has decided to allow to complete without interference. 6-month recurrent cycle for everyone. We'll build it into the scheduling system." He brought his attention back to the room. "I'm not here to establish a hierarchy. I'm here because this fleet has been operating without a coherent safety architecture, and that's a condition that eventually resolves itself through one of 2 mechanisms. Either we fix it deliberately or an incident fixes it for us, and the second mechanism is not acceptable." He paused. "Any other questions before we get to work?" Lisa Hartwell, who had said nothing until now, spoke in the measured tone of someone who has been watching and has arrived at a provisional conclusion. "What's your background, if you don't mind my asking?" "I don't. Test pilot, Edwards Air Force Base, 6 years. Before that, tactical operations out of Nellis. 12,000 hours, majority military type ratings, current on the global series, the G700, the Falcon 900. He said it without inflation, the same way he'd have recited a parts number. "I've flown things that aren't in any public registry. What's relevant to this job is the judgment those hours produced, not the hours themselves." The room was very quiet. Park leaned toward Solis and murmured something. Solis nodded once, the nod of someone confirming information to someone who didn't previously have it. Harlow was looking at the table, not with the aggressive energy of a man regrouping, with the more complicated expression of someone encountering a recalibration they didn't expect to encounter and aren't sure yet what to do with. The meeting broke 40 minutes later with assignments, individual scheduling sessions with Nathan over the following 3 days, records review, the beginning of a training calendar that would be built around the fleet's operational demands rather than the other way around. People gathered their materials and filed out with the subdued energy of a group that has received more information than it expected and is still processing. Solis was the last one out except for Harlow, who had stayed seated and was looking at the window. "I owe you an apology," Harlow said to the window rather than to Nathan. The words had the quality of something that had required effort to produce, not because they were insincere, but because sincerity of this particular kind was not a practice Harlow had maintained in regular use. "What I said in the bay last week, the thing about Florida and cargo flying, that was out of line." Nathan gathered the training documents Diana had left on the table for him. "You were protecting your position. I understand the instinct. Still," Harlow finally looked at him directly, "I've been senior pilot here in everything but title for 2 years. And I've coasted on that probably, done what was needed and not pushed past it." He paused. "I want to get rated on the global. I've wanted it for 18 months and I didn't push for it because nobody was going to make me." Nathan looked at him. Harlow had talent, he'd known that since the man walked into the maintenance bay with his arms crossed, which is to say that a person's characteristic defensive posture still gives you information about what they're defending. What Harlow had been defending, it appeared, was the distance between what he was and what he could be, which was a distance he'd decided was safer to maintain than to close. "If you do the work, I'll get you in the left seat of a global in 6 months." Harlow nodded once and extended his hand across the table. The handshake was brief and carried everything that 2 men with too much professional pride to say the actual words could put into 4 seconds of physical contact. Then Harlow walked out, and Nathan stood in the empty conference room and looked out the glass wall at the ramp below, at the aircraft parked on the apron at the maintenance bay, where his toolbox still sat on the same hook where he'd hung it at the stretch of fence along the road where the school bus went past every morning. 50 yards. The distance between who he'd been last week and who he was today, measured in concrete. Diana appeared in the conference room doorway. She'd waited until the room cleared, which told him something about how she preferred to operate when the situation was genuinely hers rather than performed for an audience. "You handled that well." "I told the truth. That's usually sufficient." Harlow looked like he wanted to put his fist through the wall during the first 5 minutes. Harlow needed to know that being challenged isn't the same as being disrespected. He'll figure it out. Nathan picked up the folder. "I need to review the training records today and look at the maintenance logs from the last 18 months. Is there anything in the operational files I should know before I start pulling those?" Diana's expression shifted the professional register, and something else briefly visible, the thing she'd let him see in the ramp at Dulles. And once again on Friday, when the contract was signed, the version of her that existed before 9 years of running something hard had built its particular structure around it. "There's a request from the Pentagon. It came in this morning." She crossed to the table and set a single sheet in front of him. "They want a demonstration flight before they finalize the contract approval. Full capability showcase. Next Thursday." Nathan looked at the sheet. The specifics were what he'd have expected: a formal airborne demonstration performance envelope display, the kind of flying that existed at the intersection of what a civilian aircraft could do and what the people evaluating it needed to believe it could do. The kind of flying he'd spent 6 years doing in aircraft that made the Bombardier Global 7500 look conservative. Also the kind of flying that had been the last category he'd performed before everything changed. "I'll need the aircraft for 2 full days of preparation," he said. "My crew chief and I go over every system personally before that flight. Nobody else signs off on the airworthiness." "Whatever you need." He looked up from the sheet. "I'll fly it." Diana held his gaze. There was something in her expression that he was still learning to read, something that had more depth to it than the assessment or the calculation or the controlled authority, something that existed in the space where the professional surface and the interior of the person were less separated than she typically allowed. "Nathan." She said his name the way she'd said it on Friday without the executive register. "You don't have to prove anything to me. You know that." The words landed in a place that wasn't immediately accessible to response. He stood with them for a moment, looking at her across the conference table, and thought about what the last week had produced. Not just the job, not just the contract, or the declassified report, or the phone call with Pruitt, but the specific experience of being seen completely by someone who had initially not been able to see him at all, and of having that sight offered without condition or transaction. "I know," he said. "That's why I'll fly it." He spent the rest of Monday and all of Tuesday in the records, which was less glamorous than the demonstration flight and more necessary than anything else he could have been doing. The training files were worse than he'd expected in some areas and better in others. Hartwell was current and rigorous. Wilder had a recent check ride from a previous employer that was actually more comprehensive than anything Marsh Aviation required, and Solis, despite his limited hours, had been keeping a personal training log that showed a level of self-directed study Nathan found genuinely encouraging. The problems were concentrated in the areas where problems tend to concentrate when an organization has been growing faster than its safety culture deferred maintenance items that had accumulated into a pattern. A scheduling system that had been optimized for revenue capacity rather than crew rest, and the safety reporting infrastructure that was, as Nathan had told Diana, essentially decorative. He called a mandatory all-hands meeting for Wednesday morning. Everyone. Pilots, mechanics, fuelers, schedulers, ops coordinators. The entire operational population of Meridian's Marsh Aviation operation assembled in the main hangar bay, and Nathan stood in front of them on the concrete floor without a podium or a microphone in the same space where 5 days ago he'd been invisible behind a tool cart. "This company has been lucky," he began, and he let that sit for a moment before continuing. "Lucky that no one has been seriously hurt. Lucky that the FAA hasn't walked through those doors on a bad day and found what I found in the training records this week. Lucky that the deferred maintenance items on the schedule haven't compounded into something that ends a flight badly." He looked across the assembled faces. The pilots he'd met in the conference room, the mechanics he'd worked alongside for 3 years, Carl Whitman standing in the back with his bad knees and his arms crossed, Danny near the door with his hands in his pockets. Luck is not a safety program. Starting today, it isn't the one we're using. He laid out the changes: the reporting system overhaul, the maintenance log audit, the crew scheduling restructuring to build in proper rest intervals. He told them that every person in the hangar had the authority to stop a flight if they saw something that didn't look right, and that using that authority would not cost them their job, and that failing to use it when they should have would. He told them that the standard for workmanship was the standard that kept people alive, which was not the same standard as the one that met the minimum regulatory requirement, and that he expected the first from everyone in this building and would accept nothing less. Then he told them about the maintenance pay. The room's reaction was not applause, it was silence, which was more honest. The silence of people absorbing information that they hadn't allowed themselves to expect, checking it against their experience of how organizations communicate when they're telling the truth versus when they're performing the appearance of telling the truth, and finding that this felt like the first kind. Carl Whitman spoke from the back of the room. His voice carried the specific weight of someone who has been in a place long enough to have been disappointed by it more than once. Who guarantees it? Because the last time someone filed a report that made management uncomfortable, he was on the night shift inside a week. Nathan looked at him directly. "I guarantee it. And if anyone in this building experiences retaliation for a legitimate safety report, they come to me. Not HR, not the ops manager, not whoever's in charge of making the problem disappear quietly. Me. You have my direct number by end of day today." He paused. "Does that work for you, Carl?" Carl looked at him for a long moment, the assessment of a man who has learned to read the difference between words and intentions in the specific way that people learn it when the words have let them down enough times. "Yeah," he said finally. That works. After the meeting, Nathan moved through the hangar and talked to every mechanic and fueler on the floor. He knew most of them by name, from 3 years of working beside them, knew the specifics of their situations, whose kids were in school, whose knees were going, who had been quietly doing exceptional work that nobody in the operations building was aware of because nobody in the operations building had been paying attention to that floor. He listened more than he talked because the information that flows upward in any organization is always impoverished compared to what the people doing the actual work know, and what he needed most right now was accurate information. Danny caught him near the hangar doors on his way back to the operations building. The young fueler had the particular energy of someone who has something to say and has been waiting for the right moment, which had now arrived. "Mr. Cole, what you did in there, nobody's ever said those things to us in a meeting, not in the 3 years I've been here. It should have been said a long time ago. The pay thing, my wife and I have been trying to make the numbers work for a year. This changes a lot." He stopped, started again. "I just wanted you to know it matters, to real people, not just on a spreadsheet." Nathan put his hand briefly on Danny's shoulder. "Then go home tonight and tell her. And come back tomorrow and do the best work of your life, because that's what the people riding in these aircraft are trusting you to do." He said it without ceremony, not a speech, just the thing that was true. The evaluation flight with Harlow happened Thursday morning before the Pentagon demonstration was finalized. Nathan had scheduled it deliberately. He wanted Harlow evaluated and, if warranted, restored to full operational standing before the week's highest visibility event, because the team he was building required Harlow to be inside it as a functional member rather than outside it as a persistent point of resistance. They flew a Citation X for 2 hours over the Shenandoah Valley, Nathan in the right seat, this time Harlow in command. Nathan put him through the standard emergency scenarios: single engine failure, pressurization loss, hydraulic degradation, and 3 instrument approaches at minimums using the simulator overlay protocol he'd adapted from his Air Force training methodology. Harlow was good. Not just technically competent, but genuinely good, the kind of pilot whose hands know things before his brain has finished the calculation, whose spatial awareness in the aircraft is instinctive rather than constructed. What he lacked was not ability, but the discipline that comes from being tested regularly against an honest standard, and what Nathan observed over 2 hours was a man discovering that his ceiling was higher than he'd been allowed to find out. When they landed, Harlow taxied to the ramp in a different quality of silence than the one he'd brought to the conference room. He sat with the engines winding down for a moment before he spoke. "You fly right seat the way most people fly left seat. I've spent time in both. I can tell." A pause. "I've been coasting. You were right about that, even though I didn't want to hear it." He looked at the instrument panel rather than at Nathan, the way people look at neutral objects when they're saying something that requires some distance to say. "I kept waiting for someone to push me past where I was. Nobody did, so I stayed there." "Nobody's going to wait anymore," Nathan said. It wasn't a threat. It was information, and Harlow received it as information. "You've got the talent, Harlow. Don't waste it being comfortable." He submitted the evaluation that afternoon. Proficiency confirmed, currency valid, recommended for immediate return to full operational status, flagged for global type rating upgrade program beginning the following month. When Harlow passed the ops building and saw the evaluation in his file, he stopped by Nathan's office doorway, the small second-floor room with the window overlooking the ramp, and said nothing, just nodded once, which communicated everything that needed communicating. Thursday evening arrived with a quality of stillness that Nathan associated with the night before, something significant. Eli was in bed. The apartment was quiet. His phone buzzed with an email from Diana. The Pentagon had confirmed their observation team for the following morning, 4 officials arriving at 0900. The email ended with a line that wasn't in her professional register. "I know what tomorrow is. I just wanted you to know that whatever happens up there, you've already changed something down here." He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table and went to bed. He was at Meridian by 4:30 Friday morning. The Bombardier Global 7500 sat on the apron in the pre-dawn dark, and Nathan walked around it with a flashlight in the way that a person walks around something they are personally responsible for, in a way that goes beyond professional duty. Every panel, every control surface hinge, every tire, every fluid access point, every antenna and sensor and navigation light. He checked the hydraulic system twice, all 4 circuits, the reservoirs, the actuator connections, because the hydraulic system was what he knew, because he'd spent 3 years learning the ways these systems could fail from the inside of them, and because trust in a machine is earned through exactly this kind of attention at exactly this kind of hour. Carl Whitman arrived at 5:15, limping on the knees that had logged 16 years of concrete. He came with coffee and the expression of someone who has decided to be present for something. Anything. It's clean. Nathan straightened from the nose gear inspection. Best maintained aircraft in the fleet, actually. Whoever did the last hydraulic service did good work. Carl looked at him. That was you. 8 days ago. Nathan considered this. Then it should be fine. They went over the aircraft together, Nathan directing Carl, verifying the two of them moving through the pre-flight in the methodical sequence that has no shortcut, because shortcuts are what pre-flights exist to prevent. By the time the maintenance crew began arriving at 7, the aircraft had been inspected by 2 sets of hands that knew exactly what they were looking at, and the discrepancy list was empty. The Pentagon team arrived at 9 in 2 black SUVs, 4 men in dark suits who carried themselves with the specific economy of people accustomed to being observed and had decided to give nothing away. Diana met them at the terminal entrance and brought them to the observation area near the hangar chairs, a clear sight line to the runway, and a printed briefing document that her communications team had prepared. She found Nathan at the aircraft. The morning heat was building, the Virginia summer arriving at the ramp with its full intention, and she was wearing a different version of her usual precision, the suit, the posture, but the expression underneath it was stripped of the performance layer the way it had been in the conference room on Friday. "How's the aircraft?" she asked. "Carl and I went over every system. She's ready." "And you?" He looked at her for a moment. 8 days ago, he had been under this aircraft with bleeding knuckles invisible, and she had pointed at him from across a hangar with the casual authority of someone who has never had to consider whether the people in their peripheral vision are visible to themselves. Something had changed between that moment and this one, and the change was not only about him. "Ask me after we land," he said. Diana nodded. Then quietly, in the register that belonged to the version of her that existed before 9 years of building had deposited its layers, "Nathan, he would have loved to see you do this." She had never said Drew Calloway's name. She'd read the file which contained it, and she'd understood what it meant. He knew this because she was not a person who left information unprocessed. The fact that she said he, rather than using the name, was its own kind of care, the recognition that some things don't need to be named to be acknowledged. He stood with it for a moment. The heat on the tarmac. The aircraft behind him, enormous and clean and ready. The observation area where 4 federal officials were reviewing their briefing documents. The fence line where the school bus would pass in a few hours, carrying a 9-year-old who had known for 5 months that his father could fly and had said nothing, waiting. "Yeah," Nathan said. He would have. Solis was already in the right seat when Nathan climbed the stairs, checklist open to the correct page systems, initialized his posture carrying a different quality than the white-faced kid who'd gripped the armrest 8 days ago in a left seat he wasn't rated for. A week of daily training sessions had done what daily training sessions do when they're designed correctly. They'd replaced anxiety with procedure, and procedure with something beginning to approach genuine competence. "Pre-flight complete," Solis said. "All systems green. I ran it twice." "Good. We run it again." Solis accepted this without reaction, which was its own evidence of progress. They went through the checklist a 3rd time, Nathan's hands moving across the panels with the efficiency of someone for whom the instrument layout has been internalized to the point where thought and motion are the same thing. Checking not because he didn't trust Solis, but because trust in aviation is built through the repetition of verification, and the day he stopped verifying was the day verification stopped meaning anything. When the aircraft was ready, Nathan keyed the radio. Meridian Ground Wraith 1 requesting engine start and taxi clearance. Pentagon observation flight runway 27, 2 souls on board. The ground controller paused the brief hesitation of someone registering an unusual call sign. Then, Wraith 1 Meridian Ground Roger, cleared to start. Taxi via Bravo to runway 27, priority handling in effect for your operation. Bravo to 27 priority acknowledged Wraith 1. Solis looked at him across the center console. Wraith. Old call sign. What does it mean? Nathan's hands were moving through the engine start sequence. Something that's present but can't be seen. A ghost. The second engine came online with the particular note of a Rolls-Royce Pearl at idle deep civilized containing its power the way large things contain power when they're not yet fully engaged. Not accurate anymore. They taxied in the strengthening morning sun. Nathan's eyes moved across the instruments in the rhythm of someone who has never stopped reading them, even in the years when reading them was theoretical rather than practical. The instrument scan is a habit that a pilot either maintains or loses, and Nathan had maintained it through a decade of work that kept him close enough to aircraft to keep the habit alive even when the application was dormant. At the runway threshold, he completed the final checks. Everything was correct. Everything was ready. He took one breath, the single deliberate breath that marked the boundary between preparation and execution, and then he was in the space where thought and action are the same thing, where the aircraft becomes an extension of intention rather than a machine being operated. Meridian Tower Wraith 1 ready for departure runway 27. Wraith 1 winds 230 at 10, cleared for takeoff runway 27. He pushed the throttles to their stops. The Rolls-Royce Pearls went from restrained to fully present in the time it took the aircraft to move from stillness to motion, and the Global 7500 accelerated down the runway with the committed urgency of something that has been correctly prepared and is now being correctly used. 80 knots, 100. V1. Solis's call was clean precise on the exact airspeed. Rotate. Nathan pulled back and the aircraft lifted off runway 27 at Meridian Aviation Services and began to climb, and the transition from ground to sky was what it had always been, a distinct and permanent change in the nature of the world. The specific sensation of leaving one set of laws behind and entering another. He did not level off at the standard departure altitude. He pulled the nose into a steep tactical climb, the angle of departure that military pilots use in environments where altitude is survival, the kind of departure that commercial aviation never needs, and that the 4 men in the observation area below were going to recognize immediately for what it was. Solis pressed back into his seat. Aggressive climb. Standard tactical departure. Tell me when we hit 5,000. 5,000 now. Nathan rolled the aircraft into a banked turn that brought them back around wings clearly visible from the observation area and flew 3 precise patterns designed to display what the Global 7500 could do, in hands that understood its full envelope. Not the envelope that airlines and charter operators inhabit, which is a small and conservative neighborhood inside the larger territory, but the actual edges of what the aircraft was engineered to accomplish. The patterns were tight, and the transitions were immediate, and from the observation area below, 4 men who had spent careers around military aircraft watched and did not look away. Then he set up for the high-speed pass. "I'm going to run the runway at red line," he told Solis. "Call any anomaly." "Understood." A pause. "How close to red line?" "Red line." Solis tightened his hands on his thighs. Not the armrest, which was progress, and watched the airspeed indicator as Nathan pushed the throttles to maximum and brought the nose down toward the extended center line. The aircraft accelerated through 400 knots, 450. The airframe communicated its velocity through every surface, the kind of total body feedback that exists at the edges of an aircraft's certified envelope, where the machine is operating in the territory it was built to reach but rarely taken. At 480 knots, The hydraulic caution light for System 2 came on. Nathan saw it in the same instant Solis did. The response was simultaneous and unhurried, which is what correct emergency response looks like, not slow, but occupying a different relationship to time than panic occupies. His eyes went to the backup pressure gauge, the hydraulic system schematic on the secondary display, the control surface response feedback. HYD, 2 caution. Solis called, his voice holding it professional. Backup pressure. Check backup. Nathan's hands were steady on the controls, the aircraft still accelerating toward the runway at the speed it had been aimed at. He had 8 seconds before the decision became unavoidable. The backup gauge read normal. System 1, pressure normal. Control surface response full and correct. The caution light was a sensor, not the system, a transducer reading false in the way that sensors read false when they're aging, and the vibration at high speed produces intermittent contact failures. He had seen this specific failure mode before in aircraft that cost more and flew faster, and he knew what it was. False caution, he said. System integrity intact, we continue. Confirmed, Solis said, and the word carried something new in it, not just the response of a first officer confirming his captain's call, but the response of someone who had just watched a decision be made correctly under pressure and understood what he'd seen. They crossed the runway threshold at 500 feet and 490 knots, and the sound that reached the observation area below arrived before the aircraft had fully passed a compression of air announcing something that had already been there and was already gone, the specific acoustic signature of speed. The 4 men in the observation area stood. Nathan pulled back into a climb, bled the speed, and brought the aircraft around for the approach. The pattern was clean. The approach was configured correctly, the speeds were stabilized, and Solis called his altitudes with the crispness of someone who had taken the correction from 8 days ago and made it permanent. 500 feet, 300, 100, 50, 30, 20. The mains touched the runway at Meridian Aviation Services with a precision that came from 12,000 hours of accumulated information about where an aircraft is in 3 dimensions at every moment of an approach. Not a guess, not an approximation, but exact placement, the kind that happens when the gap between intention and outcome has been closed through more practice than most people will accumulate in a career. Solis exhaled. How? 10,000 landings, Nathan said. Start the shutdown checklist. He taxied to the ramp and brought the aircraft to a stop. The engines wound down. The cockpit fell into the particular silence that follows the cessation of things that have been producing sound, not empty, but occupied by the absence of what had been there. Nathan sat still in the left seat for a moment with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the instrument panel that had gone dark. He thought about Ace Calloway, which he did every time he flew and had done every time he flew for the last 11 years, and the thought had a different quality today than it had ever had before. Not lighter exactly, but different in the way that something changes when you've stopped fighting it. The grief was still there. It would always be there, the permanent record of a friendship and a loss that had reorganized everything that came after it. But it was no longer the thing that defined the center of gravity. It was cargo he'd learned to carry without it determining his direction. He climbed down the stairs. The observation team was already moving toward the aircraft, their pace suggesting enthusiasm that their expressions were trained to suppress. Diana reached him first, crossing the ramp at the purposeful clip he'd learned to recognize as her genuine urgency rather than her performed urgency, and when she stopped in front of him, her face was entirely unguarded in a way he'd seen only a handful of times in 8 days. "That was the most extraordinary flying I've ever seen in person," she said. "It was a demonstration. That's what demonstrations are for." "Nathan." She said his name with a directness that cut through the deflection. "The hydraulic caution. I saw the light from the observation camera feed on my tablet. You didn't abort. It was a false caution. Sensor failure under vibration. The system was intact." "How did you know?" "Because I know what a failed system looks like, and I know what a failed sensor looks like." And they look different. He held her eyes. I made the call I had the information to make. She was quiet for a moment. One of the Pentagon officials, a silver-haired man in a charcoal suit, who had the bearing of someone who had spent decades around military aviation and could therefore assess it, was approaching with his hand extended and an expression that was not his professional baseline. Nathan shook the hand and answered 3 questions about the aircraft's performance parameters with the brevity of someone who would rather the aircraft speak for itself, and then excused himself. He went to his office. Small room, 2nd floor window overlooking the ramp. He sat at the desk and opened the bottom drawer and took out the photograph. He held it for a moment, the 2 men in flight suits, the grin that belonged to someone who had never encountered the limit. He was about to encounter the youth of it, the irreversibility of it. I flew today, Nathan said to the empty office in the quiet voice of someone saying something they've needed to say for a long time and are finally saying it to the right silence. And it didn't break me. That's something I couldn't have told you 8 days ago. He looked at Drew Calloway's face, the particular aliveness of it, the quality of someone who was always entirely present in the moment the photograph captured. I'm going to keep flying. Not because I'm done carrying you, because carrying you is part of flying correctly now. It points me toward what matters. He placed the photograph on the desk face up beside the photograph of Eli that he'd brought from the apartment on Monday. The 2 pictures side by side. He looked at them for a moment, and then he opened his laptop and started building Harlow's global upgrade training plan. At 3:25, he locked the office and drove home. The school bus appeared at the corner at 3:31, and Eli came down the steps with his backpack and a piece of paper held up in both hands before he'd reached the bottom step. He ran the last stretch to where Nathan was standing. "Dad, look." The paper was a drawing done in the particular medium of 4th grade art class crayon and pencil, the colors slightly outside the lines in the way that artistic intention and fine motor control are not always perfectly synchronized. A jet aircraft in a blue sky, 2 figures visible in the cockpit windows, and below, in Eli's careful block printing, "My dad the pilot." Nathan took the drawing and looked at it for a long time. "When did you make this?" "Art class. Mrs. Rivera said, draw your hero. I asked if it had to be fictional, and she said no." Eli was watching him with the focused attention he applied to things he'd worked hard on and was waiting to have correctly received. "Is it okay that I drew you?" Nathan's throat closed the way throats close when something arrives that is larger than the space available for it. He crouched down and pulled Eli into a hug that Eli accepted for approximately 4 seconds before the structural integrity of the embrace required renegotiation. "You're squishing me, Dad." "I know. Give me a second." "You're still squishing me." He loosened his hold, but didn't let go entirely. His hands on Eli's shoulders, looking at his son at eye level in the afternoon sunlight on a Manassas sidewalk, with the drawing held in one hand, and everything that had happened in the last 8 days reorganizing itself around this specific moment, which was where it had always been pointing. "This is the best thing I've ever been given," Nathan said. "We're framing it. Really. In the good frame, not the plastic one." Eli's face produced the grin, the complete, uncomplicated tooth gap grin that had been organizing Nathan's priorities since the first time he'd seen it in a maternity ward 9 years ago. "Can I come see the airplane like the one you flew today?" "Saturday morning. We'll go early before it gets hot." "Can I sit in the cockpit?" "Yes." "Can I touch the controls?" "Some of them." "Which ones?" "The ones that don't move the airplane." Eli considered this trade-off and found it acceptable. They walked home together, Eli providing a detailed account of his day that required no questions to sustain the math test, the art class, the ongoing philosophical dispute with Jackson about whether pilots or astronauts were more impressive, which Eli had now escalated to include the argument that pilots landed their own aircraft without assistance from a ground team, which astronauts did not. Nathan listened to every word. That evening after dinner, Eli brought the old photograph from the kitchen counter where Nathan had left it visible since Monday, a deliberate choice the first time in 11 years. The picture had occupied a space in the apartment rather than a pocket. "Can I see it?" Nathan nodded. Eli took it with both hands and examined it with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered. "That's you," Eli said, pointing to the taller figure. 15 years ago. You look happy." "I was." Nathan looked at the photograph alongside his son. "We both were." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Dad, I've been thinking about something." "What?" "You said Ace believed the sky wasn't the ceiling, that it was the starting line." He handed the photograph back carefully. "I think that's what you're teaching me, with the airplanes and everything, that there isn't a ceiling." Nathan held the photograph. He thought about Drew Calloway at 26 saying exactly that, not as a philosophical proposition, but as a personal operating principle, the kind of belief that shapes what a person attempts and therefore what they achieve. He thought about Pruitt's voice on the phone, telling him that Drew had cited Nathan as evidence for the belief. He thought about Eli on the living room floor with a stack of printer paper and the absolute confidence that the current design could be improved. "That's exactly what I'm teaching you," he said. "Good." Eli stood up from the table with the decisiveness of someone who has received the answer they were looking for and is ready to move on. "Can we build another airplane? I want to try a flying wing." They sat on the living room floor for an hour. Nathan showed him the principles of a flying wing design, the way stability is achieved through sweep and reflexed trailing edges rather than a separate tail surface. The reason the Wright brothers hadn't used this configuration, despite the aerodynamic efficiency advantage, the trade-offs between stability and maneuverability that define every aircraft design decision ever made. Eli absorbed it with the particular focus he brought to things that interested him genuinely, asking questions that occasionally required Nathan to think before answering, which was one of the things Nathan loved most about teaching him. The first flying wing they built flew badly, a classic stability problem, the aircraft pitching up and tumbling within 3 feet of release. The second one, with a refined trailing edge and a more carefully placed center of gravity, flew the length of the hallway and continued into the living room, finally coming to rest against the far baseboard in a smooth, controlled glide that suggested the design principles had been correctly applied. Eli picked it up and looked at it. "Dad," he said, "I think I want to design aircraft, not just fly them, design them." Nathan leaned against the hallway wall and looked at his son, at the 9-year-old who had been building and testing and iterating all evening with the instinctive methodology of an engineer who hadn't been taught the word yet, who had spent the last hour engaging with structural and aerodynamic principles not as school subjects, but as problems he genuinely wanted to solve. "Then that's what you'll do," he said. "Will you teach me the engineering part too?" "Everything I know. And when I run out of things, I know we'll find someone who knows more." Eli launched the flying wing one more time, a clean, practiced throw that sent it down the hallway in a long, stable glide that covered more distance than anything they'd built together so far. He watched it until it landed, and then he looked back at Nathan with the expression of someone who has just proven something to themselves. "Dad," he said, "I'm glad you came back to the sky." Nathan stood in the hallway of the apartment that was too small and had bare walls and parking lot light coming through the windows, and the weight that had been sitting on his chest for 10 years was not gone. It would never be gone because the weight was love and grief braided together in the way that they braid together permanently when someone you loved at 26 doesn't make it home. But it was different now. It was cargo he'd learned to carry correctly, weight distributed forward where it could inform direction rather than impede it. "So am I, buddy," he said. "So am I." He put Eli to bed at 8:30 and read one chapter of the Rocket book and then sat in the kitchen in the specific quiet of a finished day. His phone had 2 messages he'd seen and not yet responded to, one from Frank, a brief text that said, "Only heard, the Pentagon call went well." Good. With the particular economy of Frank's emotional register, and one from Diana sent an hour ago, Morrison confirmed full contract approval this afternoon. $412 million. 5 years. "I know you'll say it was the team. You're right. But the team needed someone who knew how to lead it. Thank you." He read it twice. Then he typed back Monday, "Let's talk about Harlow's global upgrade timeline." And I want to review the scheduling system. I found 3 crew rest violations in the August records that need to be addressed before they become a pattern. The response came back in 40 seconds. Of course you did. Monday. He set the phone down and looked at the 2 photographs on the kitchen table. Drew at 26, Eli at 9, the past and the future occupying the same small rectangle of space in a kitchen in Manassas, Virginia, at the end of a day that had changed the direction of several things. He looked at them for a moment, and then he went to bed. Saturday morning arrived clear the way the best flying days arrive. High pressure, low humidity, visibility that extended to the practical limits of human vision. Nathan drove to Meridian with Eli in the passenger seat, and the particular companionable energy of 2 people going somewhere they've been looking forward to going. They walked through the hangar together. Carl Whitman was there, and Danny and 3 mechanics whose names Eli learned and immediately stored in the part of his memory that was apparently dedicated to people who worked on aircraft. Each one shook Eli's hand with the seriousness of someone who understood they were being introduced to someone important because they were. The Bombardier Global 7500 sat on the apron in the morning light, and when Nathan led Eli to the base of the air stairs, the boy stopped and looked up at the aircraft with his head tilted back and his mouth slightly open, taking in the scale of it, the white fuselage, the tall tail, the engines that at rest gave no indication of what they contained, the total physical authority of a machine built to cross continents at 47,000 feet. "It's huge," Eli said. $70 million of huge. We can go inside. That's why we're here." They climbed the stairs together, Nathan's hand briefly on Eli's shoulder at the top step. "The cabin first." Eli ran his hand along the leather seat backs with an expression of concentrated experience, absorbing the specific texture and smell and light of the interior as though he was filing it away against future reference. Then Nathan led him through the cockpit door. The left seat. Eli climbed into it, and the seat accepted his small weight, and he sat there with his feet several inches from the rudder pedals and his head barely clearing the headrest. And when his hands found the yoke, he was quiet for a full 5 seconds, which was long enough for the moment to become something Nathan would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Dad." Eli said, his voice different, not louder or more excited, but somehow more itself the way voices sound when they are entirely present in what they're saying. "This is where you sit. That's where I sit. And you fly this thing. Every chance I get." Eli looked through the cockpit windows at the runway stretching toward the tree line at the end of the field, the taxiways laid out in their organized geometry, the sky above it all beginning its day. He held the yoke lightly, feeling the resistance of the control system through his palms, and his eyes went to the horizon with the particular quality of attention that Nathan recognized from 3 years of watching aircraft, and understood immediately the look of someone whose imagination has just connected with something real, whose idea of what's possible has been expanded by being physically inside the actual thing. "I'm going to fly this someday," Eli said. Not hope, not wish, the statement of someone who has decided. "I know you are. You'll teach me. Every step." Eli turned the yoke slightly left and then right, feeling the ailerons move through the control cables, understanding in the physical language of touch how control surfaces translate intention into motion. He was 9 years old, and he was in the left seat of a $70 million aircraft at a private airport in Virginia on a Saturday morning, and somewhere in him, in the part that had been building paper airplanes and asking questions about thrust-to-weight ratios and designing flying wings on a living room floor, something had just found its shape. From the terminal window, Diana Marsh stood and watched. She had come in for a few hours of weekend work. The contract approval had generated paperwork, and paperwork didn't observe weekends, and had seen Nathan's truck in the lot, and then seen the 2 of them crossing the apron toward the aircraft. She hadn't planned to stop at the window. She stopped anyway. She watched the man and the boy in the cockpit, the small silhouette in the captain's seat, and the larger one standing behind, and she understood with the particular clarity of someone who has been given sufficient information to stop avoiding a conclusion that what she was looking at was what Nathan had been telling her since the first conversation, the thing he'd built his entire life around for 9 years, the only mission he'd said he'd never failed. She understood something else, too. Standing at the window on a Saturday morning, looking at a thing that was not her business and which she found herself unable to look away from, she understood that the 8 days since a mechanic had walked past her into a cockpit she'd told him was beyond him had changed something in her that she hadn't expected to change. Not the company, which was also changing and visibly in ways that would be measurable within a quarter. Something else. Something that had been closed for 8 years and had begun to open without her deciding that it should, the way things open when they're ready and the right conditions present themselves. She didn't name it. It was too early to name it, and naming things prematurely was one of the habits she'd tried to break. But she stayed at the window until Nathan looked up from the cockpit and saw her there, and she didn't look away, and he didn't look away, and the distance between the window and the aircraft was 50 yards of Virginia morning, and it was not at this particular moment very large. Nathan Cole was not hiding anymore. He was not the ghost the call sign had named, not the thing that was present but couldn't be seen. He had been seen completely by his son, who had waited 5 months with the patience of someone who understood that love doesn't rush the thing it loves. He had been seen by a crew that now worked differently because he worked among them. He had been seen by a woman at a third-floor window who was still learning, as he was still learning what to do with the particular surprise of being genuinely known by someone you hadn't expected to know you. He had been seen by himself finally reading 47 pages that said what the truth had always been, that he had flown with everything he had and held his position past the point of safety, trying to bring someone home, and that the outcome of that day was not the measure of who he was, but the weight he'd carried while remaining exactly who he was, a man who showed up, who did the work, who came home, who stayed. The photograph of Drew Calloway was in his chest pocket. It would stay there. The weight of it was not a burden anymore. Or not only a burden, it was a compass pointing toward the things that mattered, toward the sky and the boy and the work and the small braveries of ordinary life that add up over time to something that can't be taken back. He turned back to his son in the captain's seat, the boy whose hands knew the shape of the yoke now, whose eyes already held the horizon like something they were working toward. "Ready to see the engines?" Nathan asked. Eli looked at him with the grin, the complete gap-toothed, entirely unself-conscious grin that organized everything. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go."